Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Obweg, the Director of Outreach and Communications. Appreciate everyone for being on today. This is just a 5-minute check, and we will go ahead and get started shortly. Thank you for everyone for joining. Hi, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started in a few minutes. Thanks again for everyone for being here. We'll go ahead and get started again in a few minutes. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Mark Obwake. I'm the Director of Outreach and Communications for the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. And I thank you everyone for being here for our virtual Atlanta family member update. We apologize we can't be there in person with you today, but we appreciate everyone accommodating us and taking the time to join us virtually for what should be a great day's event today. I would like to acknowledge that even though our official start time is 11, a lot of you have been up already early morning, speaking with your analysts, speaking with the service casualty officers on your loved one's case. So hopefully your individual meetings have been going well. Now, our primary purpose today is to provide you with updates on our ongoing efforts to recover your loved ones, whether it was during the Vietnam War, the Korean War, or World War II. We have over 35 government personnel here to deliver briefings, answer your questions, and virtually discuss the cases of your loved ones. While I'm here today in the DMV area, we have representatives, whether they're in Hawaii, Nebraska, Texas, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, and even Delaware. We're all here for you because that's what our focus is here today, for you. Now, today we have registered more than 265 individuals present, whether you're a mother, father, brother or sister, aunt, uncle, or cousin. You're representing those 152 missing service members. And of those 152, 108 were soldiers, 24 were sailors, 12 were Marines, and 8 were airmen. Now, some of you have participated in our family member updates before in person. Last time we were in Atlanta, just to kind of level set everything, we had 212 family members registered. And today, again, we have more than 265 family members registered. So we appreciate, again, everyone's time for being here today. Now, of those families, 152 missing individual cases are represented. And remarkably, 76 of you are joining us for the first time. So we thank you for that, for your first timers, and we extend a special welcome. Now, our utmost dedication today ensure that you leave this virtual gathering, our family member update, with new information and insight into our relentless efforts to recover and identify your loved ones. Now, let's go over today's agenda. As you see, we've got a great set of events and briefings lined up for you today, and we'll start from the top. Right after I give my opening remarks and admin remarks, I'll pass it over to our Principal Deputy Director of DPA, Mrs. Fern Sumter-Winbush, who will provide us with a DPA update and her opening remarks. Then we'll go into a briefing with Captain Brown, Master Sergeant Lawson, and Dr. Christensen on all of whom have served on field teams. After their presentation, we'll pass it over to Dr. Denise Toe, who's one of our leading forensic anthropologists, who will explain our field operations and lab ID process. And after Dr. Toe, we'll pass it over to Dr. Charlotte Marshall from the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System, and she oversees the DNA identifications for the entire Department of Defense, and she'll explain the cutting-edge technology of DNA and identifications. After Dr. Marshall, we'll transition to our conflict-specific briefings. Mr. Dane Magoon, he's an analyst for Vietnam War. He'll start, followed by, along with Mr. Brad Taylor from the Defense Intelligence Agency. Then we'll pass it over to Dr. Jim Rose for Korean War research and analysis. Then after Dr. Rose, we'll have Dr. Kyle Bracken, who'll provide everyone with World War II information as far as research and analysis. And Dr. Bracken will be followed by Ms. Hannah Fleming from our Partnerships and Innovation Directorate, who will provide you with information on our partnership efforts. After that, we'll go into our Q&A session. And I want to take this moment to remind everyone that if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat box. We are live streaming our event today on our dpa.mil webpage, on our DPA Facebook page, our DPA YouTube page, and also our DPA LinkedIn page. Each 4 of those websites that I mentioned have a chat function. So please feel free to go ahead and drop your questions or comments in the chat box, and we will go ahead and make sure to address them during the Q&A. I would ask that everyone, if you do have a question regarding your specific loved one's case, that you reserve that for your time during your one-on-one case summary reviews. All right, all that out of the way. It's now my privilege to introduce to you Mrs. Fern Sumter-Winbush. She's the Principal Deputy Director of Defense POW MI Accounting Agency. Since 2015, Mrs. Winbush has been at the forefront of shaping agency policy, overseeing business development, and spearheading outreach initiatives to achieve DPAA's goal of providing families and the nation with the most comprehensive accounting of missing personnel from past conflicts. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Fern Sumter Winbush.
Good morning and welcome to the virtual Atlanta Family Member Update. As Mark just described, we have a very robust program. So please take an opportunity to break whenever you need, feel the need to. Ideally, we want to continue to roll through each briefing so that we can get the information that we want to talk about today to you as quickly, effectively, efficiently, and completely as possible. In addition to what we normally do on our family member updates, as Mark pointed out, I thought it was hugely important, go to the next slide, please, that we update all of you on our partnerships and innovation initiatives that range from research through investigations, all the way to excavations. The Department of Defense could never build an organization large enough to get after the 81,000 that are unaccounted for. And so we rely on our partners to help us with that. And so you're going to get a detailed brief on that today on how partners have increased our capability and our capacity. Unfortunately, due to circumstances beyond our control, this is a virtual presentation, but I will be back. You won't see me the rest of the day, but I'll be back at the end of the day to be a part of the Q&A. So if you have a question that comes up, please just jot it down so that you can remember it and it can be addressed later in the afternoon. Also, for all of the veterans that are on the call, I want to thank you personally as a veteran myself for your service, for everything that you've done and sacrificed for this country. This mission is not only a sacred obligation, but it is a moral imperative. And then I would also add, it's a promise. It's a promise that DPAA is responsible for to those service members who are still serving today, that should they become missing and they are not returned, that once hostilities cease, we will come for them. What I'm going to do next is get off camera here for about 9 minutes and show you the agency video. Those of you who have participated in these FMUs before, this may not be unfamiliar to you, but for those of you who are brand new, please listen closely because our video gives great examples of how we do our research, how we do our investigations, and how we do our recovery missions out in the field. And then once I'm done, as was mentioned, you'll have an opportunity to talk to a team from DPAA who's going to talk to you about a day in the life of a team. Over to the video. Thank you.
We write no last chapters. We close no books. We put away no final memories. An end to America's involvement in Vietnam cannot come before we have achieved the fullest possible accounting of those missing in action.
Why keep searching? The answer is simple. You never leave a fallen American behind. The mission of the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, or DPAA, is to provide the fullest possible accounting for our missing personnel to their families and their nation. Strategically located in Arlington, Virginia, with major facilities at Joint Base Pearl Harbor, Hickam, Hawaii, and Offutt Air Force Base, Nebraska, the more than 600-person newly established defense agency is jointly manned by soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, and Department of Defense civilians with specialized skills. Researching, recovering, identifying, and ultimately returning an individual to their family begins with analysis and investigation. The DPAA experts begin the search by studying all known information regarding the circumstances of each loss. Historians and analysts gather information from U.S. veterans, foreign witnesses, archival records, and other sources. They then create a case file for each unaccounted for American. This file may include historical records, official correspondence, maps, photographs, daily activity logs, and medical and personnel records of the missing person. These files are continually updated until an identification is made.
Once the research has been done here, and we get the command's approval, we send out small teams. It could be up to 2 people, it could be a 10-person team, conducting interviews at a villager's house, at a district office, or in a combination of going to the site first and then conducting the interviews on site.
Once all available information is analyzed, a decision can be made to disinter individuals buried as unknown or conduct field investigations. During a typical investigation mission, personnel interview potential witnesses, conduct on-site reconnaissance, and survey terrain for safety and logistical concerns. Teams also try to generate new leads that may result in future recoveries. The main goal of the investigation is to obtain enough information to correlate or connect a particular site with one or more missing Americans. If enough on-site evidence is found, the site will be recommended for recovery and excavation. Recovery sites range in size from a few square meters, such as in individual burials, to areas larger than football fields for aircraft crashes. DPAA may hire as many as 100 local workers to help with the excavation process.
This job has so many benefits. For me personally, it's an opportunity to serve the country, but also our fighting forces and kind of contribute to that as well. Professionally, it's just an incredible challenge to get to work in all the countries where we work, to travel to these amazing sites, to work with the local villagers and local officials, and just have the opportunity to give somebody some answers after decades of waiting to know what happened to their loved one, and maybe just wrestling with the grief that lack of information and lack of answers brings. We have the chance to resolve that for them, and that's just an incredible opportunity.
Investigative and recovery missions in search of missing Americans take DPAA personnel to distant, remote, and often dangerous locations all over the globe. Rice paddies in Southeast Asia, areas on the Korean Peninsula, 16,000-foot mountaintops in the Himalayas, and underwater sites off the coast of Papua New Guinea. And we still continue to search the battlefields of World War II throughout Europe. After a successful recovery, all evidence is then transported to the DPAA laboratories. Once they've arrived in the lab, the painstaking process of identification begins. This is the final step of the mission, leading to the return of an individual. In many of the cases, an important step in the identification process is DNA analysis, which is accomplished by cutting a bone sample that is sent to the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory. One of the challenges DPAA faces today is the lack of reference samples from family members of those still unaccounted for. Any person who is a relative of an unaccounted for American is encouraged to contact their service casualty office to ensure there is a DNA reference sample on file for that service member. DPAA makes an identification when all available evidence, remains, artifacts, and historical documents point to the same person. The ID process can take anywhere from a few months to several years to complete. Any unresolved cases are kept open with the hope that new evidence will be found, or new technologies will be developed to make a future identification possible. Once an American has been identified, their remains are returned to their family through their respective service casualty office. They are returned home with full military honors and given the respect they earned through their service and sacrifice for their country.
Oh, as a family member, this agency, to me, is doing phenomenal work, and in a very personal way, because when somebody loses somebody like my father, and you really don't know what the story is for 70 years. And then you find an agency that knows about him and keeps his memory alive, keeps the mission alive to try to find him. It's very meaningful in a very personal way, because it means you're not just doing this yourself alone. You have a whole body of people who are concerned about finding your dad and bringing him home.
That says something about how we honor our dead, particularly those who have served this nation. I'm very grateful to all of the DPAA and related agencies and the military in general, as they've pursued this in our government, and for our citizens, because they think it's an important enough mission to continue. And the way we value life, and very few nations, I don't think any other nation to this degree does this.
Which, makes me proud to be an American.
I just wanted to yell openly to everybody out there, he's home, he's home. I couldn't believe it. And when I went up and touched his name, I thought, you're home, you're home. It's unbelievable. I'm glad I live in the United States of America and that we have this attitude. Leave no man behind. We're so fortunate. I want you to know, and I know from my own experience, that if something's happened to you, we will be looking for you.
The men and women of the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency are united in their effort to recover and return as many of our missing personnel as possible. One more patriot return, one more family that now has answers. One more step in fulfilling our nation's promise.
Great. Would also like to let the families know that if you want to share that video or view it again, you can always either go to our Facebook or to our www.dpaa.mil website. Going back to the briefing, our mission and this accounting effort is both global and generational. With over 81,000 still unaccounted for, it's a daunting task. It's slow, and it takes a lot of effort. Out of the 81,000, we believe that about 38,000 can actually be recovered. And that's because the remainder are losses that are due to either deep sea losses or they are high-speed aircraft crashes. And the remains we believe that the remains just won't be found. I am happy to update, though, for the fiscal year 2023 that began September of last year and ended on 1 October of this year. We accounted for 158 personnel. 115 were accounted for from the World War II. 39 were accounted for from the Korean War and 4 from the Vietnam War. And when I talk about numbers, whether it's accounting numbers or whether it's the numbers of accounted for, we all know that really we're talking about not only people who were lost, but we're also talking about families who want answers. Fortunately, this mission is widely viewed as humanitarian around the globe. And so we have pretty much untethered access to a lot of our locations. You'll hear a little bit about the Vietnam War today. There are some challenges with getting to different sites, but at the end of the day, our host nation partners are very supportive of what we do. And in many cases, some of them have actually conducted excavation missions for us. The last thing I want to talk about real quickly is our budget. With our budget, as you know, the president's budget for fiscal year 2024 that began on 1 October has not been approved. And so right now, DPAA is forced to operate under funding levels that were appropriated in FY 2023. So what that really means is for the budget increases that we received for FY 24, which is to the tune of 46 million. So it's no small impact, are being held up until our government can pass the budget. Fortunately, here in DPAA, we anticipate this every year. And so we try not to front load a lot of our missions during the first quarter because we anticipate there will be some challenges with our funding. And so right now, the operational level is at a level where that we can afford. Go to the next slide. And for FY 2024, once we get our full budget, we expect to be in 40 countries around the globe conducting, and organic is actually DPAA field teams, 29 investigation teams, 19 recovery teams. In addition, for our private partners, 35 investigation teams, 41 recovery teams. And then our host nation partners, they will be conducting 1 investigation team and 1 recovery team. What that really equates to is a few hundred, both DPAA, partner, and host nation personnel conducting operations around the globe. We plan our operations 2 years out. So this FY 2024 was actually planned in 22. It was locked in 23. And as soon as we get our budget, we will be off to the races with the ability to execute all of our planned missions for FY 2024. Next slide. So I'm going to stop there. I hope, and normally my remarks are much longer than this and I go into a lot of detail. However, as I mentioned, we have a very robust and packed schedule today. And I want to make sure that I provide enough time for the rest of the DPAA team, for DIA, and for the Armed Forces Medical Examiner, Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory, giving them enough time to provide their presentations today. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the Q&A.
Thank you, ma'am. Next, we're going to transition to Captain Brown, Master Sergeant Lawson, and Dr. Christensen for a Day in the Life of Field Team panel. Over to you, gentlemen.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Captain Brown, and I have the team here with you, and we're going to discuss today what the day in the life of a team member on a recovery mission is like. Next slide, please. So this is our agenda. So we're going to talk about the roles and responsibilities of each of the, as we call the triangle of leadership here presented in front of you. We'll go over the our departure, arrival on the site, our site setup and survey, as well as the daily work, the field life, what happens when we find something out there in the field, and then how we close the site at the end of the mission, and all of how we interact and build relationships through our other nations. Next slide, please. So I'm Captain Matthew Brown. I've been with the agency coming up here on a year. I've had the opportunity to go on 2 missions. Master Sergeant Lawson, could you introduce yourself, please?
I'm Master Sergeant Eric Lawson. I've been with the agency for just almost 2 years now, and I have completed 6 different joint field activities.
And I'm Dr. Alec Christensen. I've been with the agency since before Master Sergeant Lawson enlisted in the United States Army, and I think before Captain Brown entered middle school. I started in 2002, and I've lost track, but I've been out over 30 times at this point. So.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So we receive our missions roughly 90 to 120 days out. From there, we work with our plans department, whether it be with our Indo-Pacific or our European Mediterranean directorates, and we work through looking at the site, looking at an overview of the case summary, and we analyze the terrain, try to identify what we're getting ourselves into. As you'll see in the next couple slides and throughout the presentation, there are some really adverse terrain that we battle through and we're able to overcome. And sometimes it takes a team training up for a little bit before we go. And sometimes you're lucky and you're able to go to a nice flat rice field where we're able to dig very easily. But we receive the mission 90 to 120 days out. We go through our planning stages. And then about a week out, we bring in our what we call STIAs, which is a short-term individual augmentee. They're personnel from outside the DPAA, military personnel, that are temporarily assigned to the DPAA and fall under us for the mission. And so we'll bring them in for our 4 to 6 week mission. And from there, we integrate them here at Hawaii before we fly out in military aircraft out to whatever site or country location that we are going to. Dr. Christensen, is there anything you want to talk about when we get to the site and we're ready to set up?
Well, I mean, it completely depends on the site that we're going to, but usually one of my first tasks on the site is to figure out where we're going to dig. I mean, that's primary. To lay out an excavation grid to organize how we're digging and record where we're finding things, and then to figure out where we're going to build a screening station so that we can process all of the dirt that we dig up and look for evidence in it.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So here you can see some more adverse terrain that some of our DPAA team members have had to encounter. So sometimes when these sites are up on the top of a mountain or a hillside, that means that we need to spend at least a week carrying all this equipment up that mountainside to the top and then assembling any kind of structure or screening mechanism that we will need. As well as when we first get onto the site, one of our main priorities, our first priority, is to have our EOD technicians go ahead and sweep through the area for any kind of unexploded ordnance. Most importantly, because the safety of the team is one of the most important things out there, and we want to make sure that we bring everyone home at the end of the day. Master Sergeant Lawson, do you want to talk about some of the adverse terrain you've seen in your time at the DPAA?
Yes. Case in point that Captain Brown was talking about, you can see the photos that are on the right side of your screen. This was from a mission earlier this year in southern Laos on a hilltop that had a nice, probably good half mile, maybe a little bit less trail that we had to walk up to get to the site where we were working. In addition to that, we lived in a base camp, which was probably 3 or 4 miles down the road. So we lived and worked pretty much in the same area. But on this mountaintop, like Captain Brown said, we had to get everything to the top. And then we also wanted to conduct some wet screening operations, which required logistical planning and constant movement of 10,000 liter water trucks to and from the site throughout our 6.5 to 7 hours of work, and then pumping that all the way up the mountain. Wouldn't have been able to do that without the help of our local workers and our detachment personnel that are there as well.
Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, so here what we're going to discuss is our screening process, building our screening stations, and then what we like to call the bucket brigade. So Dr. Christensen, do you want to talk through the screening process for us, please?
Well, it depends a lot on what site we're at. The easiest are under our standard operating procedures, every bucket of dirt that we excavate from a site is passed through mesh with 1/4 inch screen or 1/4 inch openings in the screens to ensure that anything the size of a human tooth or larger that is in that dirt is found and recovered by us, because it doesn't serve us any purpose if we go to a crash site, we excavate it, and we leave the remains of the pilot behind because we didn't find them. We have to pass all the dirt through screens so that we can find evidence in it. If it's dry dirt that is fairly easy to screen, we'll just use dry screens. We'll just a wooden screen with mesh and shake it and pass the dirt through it. On a lot of sites, we find the dirt just doesn't want to go through screens like that, so we have to use wet screens, as you see in the lower right image there. Either small wet screens with like garden hoses, or versions like you see here where we're pumping high pressure water through fire hoses to get mud and clay off of anything that's buried there. And that takes a lot of water. It takes a lot of fairly complicated setups sometimes that I generally rely on my team sergeant to deal with. And then we will dig, we'll dig on the site, controlling exactly where each bucket of dirt is coming from. Because again, you want to know, if you find anything important, you want to know where it came from. So we're tracking where the buckets came from. Usually we'll have a line of local workers who are passing buckets hand to hand. Sometimes we'll use wheelbarrows or zip lines or other setups depending on terrain. And the buckets go from the excavation unit to the screens. All the dirt gets shaken off or rinsed off. And anything that is in that dirt that is not natural to the dirt gets set aside, examined by American team personnel, and anything that is incident related gets pulled out, put in a bucket for me and my life support investigator to examine.
Awesome, thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, so here we have what Master Sergeant Lawson was talking about a little bit ago in base camp field life. So when we go out to these missions, generally we'll try to work on 9 working days in a row and then a 1 day off. This lets us maximize our opportunity out there because we want to put all of the manpower we can towards finding the individual and bringing this person home to their family. And sometimes that requires us to live out at the site in a base camp. Generally, when there's no guest house or hotel stay that we can be at within 90 minutes, we will look to base camp at a site. So when you're base camping out at a site, it's exactly what it looks like. You're covered in mud, everything has dirt on it, you're living out of a tent, but we generally have a gym built there, and we'll try to have laundry done on a daily basis with the local contractors, as well as they'll set up a restaurant for us to enjoy some of the local cuisine. Myself and Master Sergeant Lawson just got back from a trip to Southeast Asia last week, and some of the local cuisine they had us enjoying were eels, crickets, beef heart, liver. They did cook us a snake, which is a very bony meal if you've never had snake before. But all of it is a great opportunity, and the locals really enjoy it when you sit down and you have the time to eat and share a meal with them and learn about their culture. Next slide, please. So with us being a worldwide deploying agency, the conditions you can see in the field can vary extremely. As you can see in the 2 pictures, one is in a Southeast Asia, extremely hot, probably 90+ degrees every day, where you're sweating through your clothes and changing them out halfway to avoid a heat rash while you're working. And on the right-hand side, you see someone in the mountainside covered in snow. And all of those missions all stem out from here in the DPAA. And our teams are trained and ready to go for any type of environment or condition. But this just goes to show you the breadth of how adverse the conditions can be and how just flat out tough it can be on the team members. Next slide, please. Okay, so Dr. Christensen, can you talk to us about what happens when we identify something in the screens?
Well, when a team member finds, a US team member finds something in the screens that they think is related to the incident, they'll set it to the side, and then the scientific recovery expert and the life support investigator will regularly inspect everything that was found to determine what is evidentiary. And the LSI is an expert on equipment issued to and carried by air crew, which for us is a very important proxy for where the remains of said crew members might be. I am an expert at recognizing human remains and other forms of evidence. And between us, we'll set aside the stuff that we know that matters and the stuff that is not evidentiary. Everything that is evidence is carefully bagged up, labeled with exactly where it was found, sealed, and then either I or my LSI will retain custody of it until the moment that we get back to Hawaii and sign it over to our evidence custodian here.
Awesome. Thank you. And when we do find something out there in the field, generally we have the opportunity to showcase it to the team and explain what it is and how it correlates to our circumstance of loss. And when the team sees that, it's just like a huge spike in morale.
Yeah.
Everyone is so excited, and you'll never see people work harder than after we find something. Everyone gets just so fired up, and all we want to do is just keep going until we can completely find that person and bring them home.
Once one team member finds a dog tag or a tooth, suddenly everybody wants to.
Next slide, please. Okay, so towards the end of a mission, some of the things we're going to do is we're going to inventory a lot of our equipment. We're going to try and reuse some of the equipment as if possible, and we're also going to turn over some of our expendable equipment to the locals on the site, because that equipment that we turn over, such as like tarps, wood, things like that, that I will go and you'll see that 5 years later at someone's house. They will build a brand new house out of a couple tarps and some plywood. It's incredible what they can do with really bamboo, string, any piece of material you're able to turn over to them. As well as, Dr. Christensen, could you talk through from a scientific perspective what goes into closing a site?
Well, what you see up in the top left there is one of my colleagues, Dr. Renee Zielinski, taking some of her final notes on a site. Throughout the entire recovery process, one of our fundamental principles is if you don't write it down, it didn't happen. The SRE has to document everything that happened on site, all of the scientific activities, so that we can demonstrate where any evidence we've recovered came from and what its significance is. And there you see Renee taking notes on the soil in that excavation unit and presumably what was found in there. Before we suspend operations on a site, we will photograph everything, make sure we have full notes on everything, and then make a determination as to whether we think the site should be closed because we have exhausted all reasonable opportunities to find evidence at that site, or whether we should just suspend operations and bring a team back there to continue excavating at the next opportunity.
Thank you. Next slide, please. And Master Sergeant Lawson, can you talk to us about, from the team sergeant's perspective, the end of a mission and returning home?
The end of the mission is actually a unique experience for all of us that are really involved. Normally, before these pictures would be taken, we would gather up with our local workers and government officials from the respective country that we would be in. And we would have some form of meeting that would end up turning into like a team lunch or a team dinner. And then just having, a few hours with them without the stress of the work site. It's closed and we're just going to have a good time, build the relationships that are needed to continue and going back and doing these missions. I know that the 4 times that I've been to Laos, I've worked with the same official 3 times now. So I have a really good working relationship with that gentleman. And when we see each other, when we land at the airport, it's just like we pick up right where we left off. But like Captain Brown was saying in the beginning, we take mil air flights, normally on C-17s from Hawaii, either to Vietnam or Laos. We usually have a stopover in Thailand so the crew can achieve their rest period and then fly out the next morning. The best thing about flying on mil air is it's our plane, and when it's not fully loaded with cargo or resupply to where we're going, we have the opportunity to act like we're in first class and lay down without the comfy seats. But we can hang hammocks. We'll have mattresses that we can put on the ground, and good to get a good 7 to 8 hours of sleep before we land, and then get to Thailand, take a bus to a hotel, go eat some local food there, turn around, leave again at 4 o'clock in the morning, and then get into Laos or Vietnam. So other than the accountability process, which can be a little bit painful, especially with a 4 o'clock wake up and a 4:30 hit time, we've been good so far. Everyone is always accounted for in those areas. But we have some stragglers coming in late, but that's fine. But when it comes to the plane, what you're seeing here is if the crew chiefs let us put hammocks out, we can lay down, and just that way when we get on the ground, we can hit the ground running. I try and personally put myself on the country's time that I'm going to. So there's about a 17-hour time difference between Hawaii and Laos and Vietnam. So I'm usually awake on the plane for a little bit, but I will get a nap.
And it's roughly about a 19-hour flight for us on our flight back, where we usually do not get off the plane. So you try to get as much sleep as possible, but sleeping for 19 hours is not always great. And because we do usually cross the international date line, you might leave on 2 p.m. on a Tuesday and land in Hawaii at 10 a.m. on that same Tuesday. So you get to live the day all over again, which is a lovely opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Next slide, please. It's very long birthdays. So lastly, one of the most important pieces of our missions is the opportunity to work with the host nation and build relationships. Nothing we do out, especially in Southeast Asia, is done alone. Everything we do is hand in hand with the local workers as well as their governments. And as you can see in the pictures, up in the top left is what Master Sergeant Lawson was talking about when we get to share a meal with the locals on that last couple days when the site's closing out, as well as we try to gather up some money from the team and purchase some supplies and things like that hand out to the local villagers that they significantly appreciate. And also, as you can see on the right, when we get off for the day, usually around 16:30, we'll usually try to find some children out in the park or somewhere playing sports and join in with them. Here, I think this team was playing playing soccer with the group of children and young adults out there. And they just absolutely love it when we get out there and work together. Thank you guys for your time. This will conclude our brief. And if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or we'll get them at the Q&A at the end of the day. Thank you, guys.
Next, we have Dr. Denise Toe, our laboratory manager from DPAA. Dr. Toe, over to you.
Hello, and good morning, everybody from Honolulu, Hawaii, bright and early. My name is Denise, and I'm one of the laboratory managers here. And I know Dr. Christensen was not keeping count, but I do keep count. He's done 42 missions. I have not done that many. I've done only about 25. But I've been with the agency for 18 years now, and I'm a board certified forensic anthropologist, which means I am an expert in bones. I'm also a forensic archaeologist, and I've been doing archaeology for 30 years, which means I'm an expert in dirt. You put those two things together, it means that I'm an expert in the search for, the recovery, the analysis, and the identification of human skeletal remains. Next slide, please. I have the privilege today of sharing with you the science that is done by the laboratory, both outside of these walls and inside of these walls. The team that you met touched on it just a little bit, and I've got about 25 minutes, and there's a lot to squeeze in there, so I'll be available for questions and answers later as well. Next slide, please. So science, next one after that, please. Science begins in the field. I know I'm wearing a lab coat. I know I'm here in the building, but science begins in the field. And when it begins in the field, what I'm talking about is the archaeological science. You've met the team. We've got a multidisciplinary team that goes out, but it's all run by a forensic archaeologist who we in the laboratory call a scientific recovery expert. And that's where we meant, that's what most people are aware of regarding how we get remains in the laboratory. We do recoveries around the world. We also consider the field outside of these walls. We get remains from these disinterments, from cemeteries, of individuals who we refer to as unknowns. These are individuals who, at the time of the war, we knew that they were American. We just could not render the identification, didn't have the information and the technology. So they were interred as unknowns around the world. But now we have the technology, and now we've got a plan in place to be able to identify them. Most of these come from either the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, which is here in Hawaii, about 10 miles in that direction, and also all around the world, Manila, the Ardennes in Belgium, even Tunisia, we will disinter these unknowns. Excuse me. I'll get back to the unknowns in just a second. Next slide, please. But back to the field of archaeological recoveries. When it comes to archaeology, most people think archaeology is, it's an operation. It's something we just do with shovels. And anybody can do it, right? Because everybody knows how to dig a hole with shovels. And yes, okay, people know how to dig a hole with shovels. But the reason why you want a forensic archaeologist, the reason why you want a scientific recovery expert is because archaeology is in and of itself a destructive process. Now, what that means is if you go in your backyard right now and you take a shovel and you scoop out a scoop of sediment, a scoop of dirt, you've altered that location permanently. Even if you put that scoop of dirt back, you're not putting the scoop of dirt back in the exact layers it was in. So you've altered it permanently. It's a very destructive process. So by having a professional forensic archaeologist, what we're doing is controlled deconstruction. We're not just looking for these tiny little bits of bones and teeth. We're also looking for tiny little bits of data and information. And it's that data and it's that information that will help us, give us the information we need to render an identification. Next slide, please. Now, most of the time out in the field, if you saw this, you would see a wall of dirt. And that's okay. You're not wrong. You see a wall of dirt. I see something different. Next slide, please. I see something different. And I, on many occasions, have been caught by a team member during lunch. They're all over there eating lunch, and I'm sitting in the excavation unit staring at a wall of dirt. The reason why I'm staring at a wall of dirt is because I'm looking for all those little bits of not just evidence, but information. I see the top layer of humic organic layer. I see the bottom layer of incident sterile. I see the middle layer of different sediments of the incident, of aircraft wreckage, of bones and teeth. And that's why it's really important to have a forensic archaeologist trained in this to be able to tease out that information, to know where to dig, how deep to dig, how wide to dig. Next slide, please. The forensic archaeologist also can provide subtle clues as to the dirt. Not all dirt's the same, not all sediment's the same. In this particular image, you see a very clear, we picked an image that was a little bit more clear for you to see, a very clear stain on the ground. But if you didn't know what you were looking for, you'd see a stain and walk right by it. What I see is something very significant. And next slide, please. What this exact photo turned out to be, what this exact stain turned out to be a burial. And so being able to recognize the subtleties of the soil is pretty important for us out in the field, obviously, because we don't want to walk over and completely miss this burial that's in front of us. Next slide, please. So your scientific recovery expert in the field captures all those little bits of information and where everything came from. And that's really important because think about it this way. Let's say we find a watch over there with some human remains with that watch over there. And let's say over there, we find another watch and it's another assemblage of human remains. We want to be able to keep and maintain that spatial relationship between this watch over here and these remains and this watch over here and these remains. If everything comes back in one big giant bag, we've mixed everything together. Now we don't know who goes where. So being able to maintain all of that information in the field is absolutely critical for us. And that's why we've got a forensic archaeologist. Next slide, please. The other main reason why we've got a scientific recovery expert is to be able to identify the best methods in the field. Not all sites are the same. In fact, all sites are incredibly different. You can have two sites that are the exact same plane with one pilot that crashed at the exact same speed, but they're radically different in terms of how we're going to excavate them. Whether or not we can use heavy machinery, whether or not we're going to use wet screen, dry screen, even underwater, are we going to use a 4-inch dredge hose or a 6-inch dredge hose? Are we going to use a 1 by 1 meter basket or a 2 by 2 meter basket? All of that is determined by the scientific recovery expert. Next slide, please. And then back to the unknowns, which is also still the field because they come from outside these walls. These disinterments from these cemeteries, there's a lot of them, and we can't just blanket go out and pull out as many as we can, as quickly as we can. They're hard target. We are very specific with which ones can come out of the ground and when they can come out of the ground. And that really has to do with the primary source information, what the historical information said by our researchers, what the anthropological report said back in the 1940s, what the dental reports say. All that's compared with the antemortem that we have now to create what we call a short list of individuals. If I say this one skeleton in front of me is one of 82,000, that's a big number. But if I say this is one of 15 people, that's much more manageable in terms of being able to identify them. I'll come back to unknowns at the end of this talk. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So back to laboratory operations, what we do inside these buildings. We have two main locations. We think about it as saying we have one lab, two locations, one here in Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam, which is literally right behind me, and also our sister laboratory in Omaha, Nebraska. Both do the exact same thing. Both labs are identical, except for the fact that we have to deal with hurricanes. They have to deal with tornadoes over there. Both our laboratories are accredited by ANSI-ASQ National Accreditation Board. Now, what that means is, remember how I said earlier in the talk, I was board certified as a forensic anthropologist? This is very similar to that. Instead of it being me, it's our actual laboratories. We are board certified and accredited by this agency. This is an external review board that reviews us and all our procedures and all our practices to verify that what we're doing is the best practices of forensic science. In fact, our annual review concluded literally just yesterday, less than 20 hours ago. We finished our 2023 assessment by this accreditation board. And that's important to you because that tells you that what we're doing here, both outside these walls and inside these walls, is the best practices of forensic science. We are the largest forensic science laboratory of its kind in the world. So that tells you a little bit about the quality of the work that we do here. Next slide, please. So we are accredited in many different subdisciplines, and I'm going to walk you through some of these subdisciplines very quickly. But the reason why I'm walking you through these accredited subdisciplines is because each one of these subdisciplines is a line of evidence that we use in the laboratory to make an identification. If there's one take-home message that you will get from my talk here today, it's that we use multiple lines of evidence to make an ID. It's not just one kind of evidence. It's not just one thing that points to an individual. It's got to be multiple lines of evidence. So we talked about archaeology already. I won't harp on that, but we are accredited in field recovery. All of our sites are processed the same way as we would excavate or process a modern day forensic crime scene. Next slide, please. We are accredited in material evidence analysis. And what I mean by that, material evidence is anything that we recover from site and bring home that's not biological. So material evidence, we're talking personal effects like rings, wallets, dog tags, watches. We're also talking about aircraft wreckage, life support equipment, helmets, seat belts, things on an aircraft that might help. All of that is considered material evidence that could help us not just make circumstantial information on the site, but also individuate certain remains from certain people. Next slide, please. We're also accredited in forensic anthropology. This is the skeletal analysis. Now, when I have a skeleton in front of me that I'm analyzing, I'm looking at being able to establish a biological profile of that skeleton. If I'm really lucky, I have the entire skeleton. A lot of times, all I have in front of me is one single bone, one finger. So the biological profile that I'm going to be able to determine really depends on the completeness of the skeleton and how fragmented or not fragmented it is. I'm trying to figure out the sex of the individual, how old the individual is, biological ancestry, stature, in other words, height, and any sort of trauma or pathology or individuating traits that can help me identify somebody. Additionally, as a forensic anthropologist, I use this analysis to try and tease out remains. Remember that example I gave you about how sometimes if remains come in from all bagged together, I have to be able to tease out the remains of individuals using forensic anthropology. Sometimes it's a little bit easier. If I've got somebody in the incident who we know is 6'4" and another person who's 5'6", it's a little bit easier to tease them out. But if they're both 5'10", it gets a little tricky. Next slide, please. Now, the forensic anthropology also includes X-ray analysis. Now, X-ray analysis, sometimes you'll see it written as CXR, chest X-ray analysis. This is the type of analysis that is very useful for us because we realize that we have at least 13,000 X-rays of individuals from World War II and Korean War that at the time that they were inducted into the war, many of you in the audience maybe were part of this as well. You had an X-ray taken of the chest area because it was a medical procedure to look for a medical ailment. I think some of you know what ailment that is. Raise your hand in your own home if you know what I'm talking about. We were looking for tuberculosis. Tuberculosis shows up in the lungs. So it shows up in an X-ray. And so that's why these X-rays were taken. So now we've got these X-rays of these individuals. And if we have the short list and we have X-rays of those individuals, we can compare those X-rays to the X-rays that we take of remains that we have in the laboratory, superimpose them and compare them, especially the clavicle, the collarbone. That's a very unique bone. Kids break it all the time. It gets torn and ripped and muscles and ligaments get pulled. And when there's injury to the clavicle, you can't put a cast on it. And so because of that, they heal up very funny, very wonky. And so clavicles are very unique that we use. I'll get back to the clavicle example in just a second. Next slide, please. We're also accredited in odontology. Odontology is just a fancy word for dental analysis. The dental analysis is very critical for us because teeth preserve better than bones. So oftentimes we'll find teeth out in the field and we won't find bones. The teeth are incredibly strong and they are incredibly resistant to degradation in the field. So when we find them, we're able to compare the teeth that we have in the laboratory with antemortem dental records of individuals when they're still alive. Now, teeth are also great because in a forensic sense, they're great because they don't heal up. Teeth don't ever get better. All you can do is use dental work to fix your teeth. In the laboratory, we actually really like people eating a lot of sugar because we like cavities. Cavities and restorations help us quite a bit to be able to distinguish individuals from one individual to the next. Next slide, please. And finally, we're also accredited in chemistry. Now, specifically in chemistry, we are accredited in isotope ratio analysis. This is where we get really nerdy with the science. Now, the isotope ratio analysis, when we say isotopes, we're looking at elements. Think back to your high school science class, looking at the periodic table. Carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, oxygen, strontium, lead. These are elements of the periodic table. These are elements that make up the human body, bones and teeth. Now, we look at these ratios based on a very simple principle that everybody can understand. You are what you eat. So if somebody was born and raised in Kansas on a diet of meat and potatoes, their bones and teeth are going to look very different in terms of the ratio of these isotopes than somebody born and raised in, for example, Korea, that has a diet mostly of rice and grains. So we can use that isotope to tease out individuals and tease out remains in the laboratory. We're also accredited in the sampling of DNA, but I'm not going to steal Dr. Marshall's thunder. You'll hear much more about that in the next presentation. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Let's just move right on. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to walk you through an actual identification. But before I do so, let me tell you about these multiple lines of evidence, which we discussed already. It's a common misconception that we need all of them. We don't. A lot of times we would like to have all the lines of evidence for an ID, but a lot of times we're hamstrung by what we have in front of us. If there are no teeth in the assemblage in front of me, obviously we're not going to use forensic odontology as one of the lines of evidence. We don't always use DNA. If we can make an identification with the odontology and not the DNA, and we can do that faster, there's no point in waiting. If there's no need to get the DNA, then we won't use the DNA. We use as many lines of evidence as we can, as we need to make the ID, but we are oftentimes limited by what is available, especially with the records, the antemortem records that we have. The other misconception about these lines of evidence is that they're all weighted the same, and they're not. Next slide, please. Now, most people think that all of our identifications are made with DNA, and that's not necessarily true. It really depends on the strength of the evidence. I'm waiting for the next slide to move on. Yeah, there we go. Oftentimes people think DNA is the end all be all, and it's really important. It's a very powerful tool. But we use these bubbles in this particular slide to show you that for every single case, it's different. The weight of a certain line of evidence really is case by case basis. Next slide. In this other example of an identification, the DNA is there, but the CXR, the clavicle chest X-ray analysis and the dental analysis was equally powerful. And so you can see how every single identification we make, we can create one of these sort of cartoonish depictions of how strong that particular evidence is. And it's different for every single case. Now, let me show you one exact case specifically. Next slide, please. This particular case uses a whole bunch of different lines of evidence. And it's, next slide, please. It's a particular case from the Korean War. Now, we have approximately 7,600 individuals still missing from the Korean War. And that number is huge. That's a big number. So how do we go from 7,600 people to one person? Well, first we start with historical information. The historical research is also one of the lines of evidence that our researchers and historians and analysts slave over and really work really hard over to get us that information. A lot of these short lists all these short lists come from the historians and the analysts of our agency. Through the historical research, we picked specifically one battle in 1950 that spanned 1 week that resulted in many casualties. But that one battle still has 71 people unaccounted for. 71 people still missing from that one battle. So that's how first we narrowed down from 7,600 to 71. We create a short list. Okay, next slide, please. We look further specifically, and we found one particular disinterment, one particular X file that you may have to click the button a few times there, that we were able to determine that one particular unknown. We narrowed the short list down to 11 people using the historical information. And that's based on knowing that this particular unknown was still alive during this day and was buried on this day and was moved from this other grave on this day. So because of that, we're able to narrow down the field of who that could be to 11 people, from the 71 to 11 people. Next slide, please. Keep going. I think we have a little bit of animation here that we can go through. Okay, so our isotope analysis, what we ended up doing when we disinterred this remain, if you click the button one more time, we were able to determine that there was one individual in that grave. And that's pretty important. That's going to come up a little bit later about one individual in the grave. But in this particular case, it was just one individual. The purple that you see here are samples that we tested for isotope. And this is based off of the idea. Remember how I said you are what you eat? This is based off of the idea that the isotope ratio samples of your arm and your head and your skull and your kneecap are all the same. So because of that, we said, yes, there's one individual in this particular grave. Doesn't narrow us down, but at least we said that there's only one person there. We're still at 11 people. Next slide, please. So the next type of analysis we used was the DNA analysis. And in this particular DNA analysis, we narrowed down from the 11 people to 7 people. We automatically excluded 5 of them. The DNA didn't match, not a chance, not even one little bit. Now, some of you are thinking, how can we have 7 people with the same DNA? Dr. Marshall obviously is going to explain all of that. But yes, the answer is you can have people with the same DNA, depending on what kind of DNA and what parts of DNA. Think about it this way. Everybody that's listening right now has a unique social security number, right? But if you take the first 4 numbers of your larger social security number, it can match somebody else. This particular DNA analysis, depending on what kind of DNA you use, is similar to that. So in this case, we excluded 5 people, and now we're down to 7. Next slide, please. The anthropology said this individual was male, European ancestry, about 20-25, 72 inches tall. That narrowed down to 2 of the 7 fit this category. We also were able to find some individuating trait. This person had what was called exostoses, which is really fancy way of saying bone spurs, kind of. And we have one of those 2 individuals has a letter in the file that actually says a bone or gristle deposit growing from the joints of the hands and feet. That's exostoses. Next slide, please. The dental analysis was the spot on. That was the powerful one. Now, this is the upper jaw of the individual. The hole on the top is where a tooth fell out after death. So that doesn't tell us too much other than the fact that he had that tooth. But it's these big giant gaps that you see in the back that are interesting, because when you have a tooth that's pulled or falls out and you're still alive, that bone will heal up and will grow over. So we can tell by this individual, by these teeth, that this individual had lost some teeth either by accident or on purpose and pulled these teeth, and it healed up at some point right before they died. Next slide, please. And that only matched one individual. And not only did that dental pattern match that one individual, we've got a letter from his family that says, he wrote us just before he left Camp McGill that he had 2 teeth that were pulled. It doesn't get any better than that. It's really powerful, powerful information to make an ID. But in fact, it does get better than that. Next slide, please. In this particular case, the chest clavicle x-rays, the CXR, was an absolute spot on match. We compared it to the 11 people and we excluded most of them, and one of them matched really, really well. And that was the exact same one as the fellow with the tooth that was pulled. So that's how we make an identification in the laboratory. Next slide, please. So the last little bit of time that I have left, I'm sorry, I forgot this last slide. This is an example of what that identification looked like with regards to the power of the information. As you can see, the CXR was the most powerful, the strongest of the data, but all the other ones we still used as a multiple line of evidence. Next slide, please. Next slide after that. So what I'm just going to do the last minute that I have is just to give you an update on, to tell you a little bit about these special projects. These are all special projects that we have in the laboratory that have to be dedicated with a project lead and an entire team of scientists in the laboratory, because these are the kind of projects where we cannot just take one casket out of the ground and analyze that one skeleton. It doesn't work that way. Think of a jigsaw puzzle. If you take 1,000 jigsaw puzzle boxes and you pile up all the jigsaw pieces in one big pile, and then you throw out the box top, you have to analyze it all together in one big giant group. And that's what these projects are. One Korean War project, one Vietnam project, and the rest are World War II projects. Next slide, please. These projects are very much dedicated from the disinterments. There is some excavation field component to some of these, but most of them are from the disinterments. I've mentioned it before that if we have one casket, one skeleton, that's great, but it's not always that way. In fact, it's typically not that way. Next slide, please. This particular example that I'll show you is actually from the Cabanatuan prison camp. These two images that you see on the right, I want to focus you on these two images. These don't necessarily represent skeletons. These represent caskets. So two caskets we have right here. The casket on the left yielded the DNA sequences of 7 different people. So 7 people in one casket, and the one on the right had 5 people. And if you look really closely, you'll see that individual who's colored in pink shows up in both caskets. And the individual colored in peach shows up in both caskets. We've got one individual from here that showed up in 4 caskets. And that's actually not one of the hard ones. Next slide, please. The USS Oklahoma, one of the special projects that we've just finished up, the first casket that we ever disinterred from the USS Oklahoma in 2003 from the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific. One casket, the first casket, 94 different DNA sequences. So at least 94 people were represented in that one casket. Last slide. And this is why it is much, much harder for us, because oftentimes the remains are not complete. They're in tiny itty bitty little fragments, which definitely gives us more of a challenge. So my last slide, I'll leave you. I'm 1 minute over. I apologize for that. But my last slide is just to thank you for the privilege of your time. And ultimately, remember, the take-home message is that the science begins in the field with the archaeological science and the forensic archaeology. And we use multiple lines of evidence to make an identification. That's it for me. Thanks for listening, folks. I'll give it back to you, Mr. Abweg.
Thank you, Dr. Toe. Before we move on to our next panelist, a reminder that we are live streaming on our dpa.mil webpage, our Facebook page, our YouTube page, and our LinkedIn page. So we appreciate everyone for joining. And if you have a question or comment for any of our panelists today or anything about DPA, feel free to put them in the chat. If you have a question pertaining to your specific case of your loved one, reserve that for your one-on-one time with your service casualty officer and analyst. All right, we're going to move on to our next panelist, Dr. Charla Marshall from the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System. Dr. Marshall, over to you.
All right, thank you. So my slides aren't up. Okay, there we go. So I am Dr. Marshall. I am the Deputy Director of the DoD DNA Operations, and we are a part of the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System. So I've been the Deputy Director for about almost 5 months now, and prior to this role, I was the Chief of the Research Section for AFDL. So I've been with the organization for almost 10 years. Next slide. So we are not a part of the DPAA. Our parent organization is the Defense Health Agency. Defense Health Agency reports to the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. So we are a different part of the government than the DPAA. But this slide just shows you that multiple different organizations all work together to support this past accounting mission. Next slide. So here's an overview of our organization, the AFMEs. We have forensic pathology investigations, DoD DNA operations, forensic toxicology, and then we also have a business operations group. The DoD DNA operations has 2 parts. The first is the Armed Forces Repository of Specimen Samples for the Identification of Remains, or AFRSEER. If any of you are in the military, currently serving or served since 1990, we have a blood reference card for you on file downstairs in the AFRSEER. And this is a repository just of blood cards. In the event that something were to happen, we could pull that blood card and make an identification. Oh, last slide, please. For service members since 1990. The AFDL has 5 different branches: current day operations, the past accounting section, quality management, family reference samples and laboratory automation, and the emerging technology section. That's the one that I led since 2014. And that group is the one responsible for getting the new technologies online, like NGS. Okay, next slide. So the AFDL was established in 1990 to utilize DNA methods to identify the remains of US service members. This is the Department of Defense's only human remains DNA testing laboratory. And we've been partnered with DPAA since 1990 and its earlier iterations, JPAC, for example. We are an accredited forensic DNA laboratory and have been since 1998. We're accredited by ANAB to both ISO 17025 and Federal Bureau of Investigation Quality Assurance Standards. So even though we aren't a DNA crime lab, we are a human remains DNA testing lab, we still adhere to the most stringent and strict quality assurance standards that would be expected from any crime lab in the country. Next slide. So we support various missions, including our current day accounting section that deals with current day operations, family reference sample databasing, past accounting mission, and we also do worldwide support for other missions when we are called to service from the Secretary of Defense. We also do historical cases and other projects through our research group. Next slide. So a lot of people ask, why does DNA testing take so much time? So it takes time because the sample quality and the DNA quality can vary very widely depending on which sample it is and the context that it comes from. Many of the past accounting DNA samples are very similar to ancient DNA. They're very degraded and low quality. So I like to think of AFDL as a giant ancient DNA lab. We therefore have to develop our own procedures that are not used in any other forensic crime labs. For instance, our mitogenome sequencing method, our hybridization capture method, that we developed in-house. We developed it ourselves. And I'll show you some other methods that we've developed as well. And this is geared towards the successful DNA sequencing of past accounting samples. We also have very stringent quality control regimes. So what we do is make sure that all of our reagents are void of contamination. We duplicate all of our results. So we confirm that if we get a sequence from a sample, we do it a second time and confirm that sequence just to make sure that we are very confident in our data that we've obtained. So we use a combination of forensic markers for comparison, and I'll get into those. And we also have various family reference samples. Not every missing service member has all family reference samples that are possible for identification. Maybe a family member only has a YSTR family reference sample, and that determines how we do our DNA testing. So next slide. The bottom line is that it's fit for use. So every different sample and every different missing service member has a different approach that we might take to get the best result. Okay, next slide. You're familiar with the human genome, having learned about this in high school. Here's a picture of a cell. Inside the nucleus is the nuclear DNA. And this is 3.2 billion base pairs. This is your whole genome. Outside of the nucleus are mitochondria. Mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cell. And each cell has many mitochondria, perhaps 100 different mitochondria in the cell. And every mitochondrion has multiple copies of mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is a small circular genome, only 16,549 base pairs in length. So it's very small compared to the nuclear genome, but there are many copies of it in each cell. Next slide. So a typical crime lab will do two types of, or maybe even one type of DNA testing, and that is short tandem repeat, STR typing. STRs are located throughout the nuclear genome. They are located in the autosomes. So your autosomes are those chromosomes 1 through 22, X and Y being your sex chromosomes. So typical STRs are located on all of these different chromosomes. And then on the Y chromosome, there are also STRs that we type for paternal identifications. And can you click the next slide? So we have multiple different STR typing capabilities at AFDL. We have all of the different options that you would have at a forensic lab. Global filer, PowerPlex Fusion. We also have mini-filer. Mini-filer is STR typing using smaller targets. And then we also have YSTR typing. All of these we utilize all the time, every day at AFDL. Next slide. Mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomal DNA are special because they are lineage markers. Mitochondrial DNA on the left here is inherited through the mother's line. What that means is that you have the same mitochondrial DNA, exactly the same as your mother and your siblings. Any siblings who share the same mom as you all have the same mitochondrial DNA. However, only women pass down their mitochondrial DNA. What that means is that if your brother has a child, that child will not have your mitochondrial DNA, it will have your sister-in-law's mitochondrial DNA. So we call that a lineage marker because you can trace a lineage, a maternal lineage, looking at mitochondrial DNA. Y chromosomal DNA is passed through the father's line. It's paternally inherited. This means that father to son, they have the same Y chromosomal DNA, and that's passed down again to the grandson. So from father to son, so on and so forth. That's paternal inheritance of Y chromosomal DNA. And these are important because it means that we can have very distant relatives are still viable references for both mitochondrial and Y chromosomal DNA. Next slide. Autosomal DNA, or that nuclear DNA, that's obviously not the sex chromosomes. Autosomal DNA is inherited from parents to children, and every generation removed from that person shares less autosomal DNA. So for a missing service member, autosomal DNA, we really like to have siblings or children of that missing service member for autosomal DNA family references. Next slide. You can see it here that as you go out away from your person of interest self here, you share less and less DNA. So what this means is that a first cousin shares roughly 12.5% DNA with you. However, if that first cousin is a maternal relative, we can compare mitochondrial DNA to support an identification, whereas autosomal DNA would not be very helpful for a first cousin. Okay, next slide. This here is a graph showing the different types of DNA tests that have been performed at AFDL since 2016. Why 2016? Well, that's when we first brought online our NGS method. Next generation sequencing is a type of very sensitive DNA sequencing that we use currently for mitochondrial DNA. So we have two methods for mitochondrial DNA analysis: the traditional capillary electrophoresis called Sanger sequencing. And then we also have NGS, next generation sequencing. So over time, from 2016 to 2023, what we found is that we need more NGS. So we're seeing more samples from disinterments that are very degraded DNA, and they require that very sensitive next generation sequencing method. Next slide. Here you see DNA reports as of 30th of September for 2023. And this year, the AFDL has written 175 believed to be reports from DNA tests. Addendum reports were 168. These would be additional portions of service members who were already identified. 21 foreign national reports for a total of 364 for this year so far. Next slide. So I'm sure you're asking, why do we lead with mitochondrial DNA analysis? And the reason I hinted at so far is that there are thousands of copies of mitochondrial DNA per cell compared to a single copy of nuclear DNA. And what that means is in a remains from World War II, Korean War, we have a higher chance of recovering mitochondrial DNA than we do of recovering nuclear DNA. We also have a lot of mitochondrial DNA family reference sample donors because it's a lineage marker. So even very distant relatives serve as viable references for mitochondrial DNA. And also mitochondrial DNA is amenable or suitable for that NGS, for that very sensitive sequencing technique. And we can sequence it in very small fragments. So when DNA is degraded over time, this means that it won't be possible to use STR typing. When we can, we will use autosomal STRs and YSTRs after mitochondrial DNA, and this will also help segregate individuals, or it may help identify paternal relationships, and it also increases the statistical significance of the mito exclusionary results. Next slide, please. This is a paper that we published in collaboration with the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, Germany. So what we did was we looked at DNA samples from service members from the Korean War, and these are buried in the punch bowl. In the punch bowl were a set of remains from Korea that were embalmed in Kokura, Japan, in these formaldehyde vats, and then they were sprinkled with hardening compound and other chemicals before they were shipped to Hawaii and buried in the punch bowl. And through this collaboration, we found that the DNA from the punch bowl samples is just as degraded as DNA from ancient humans. Next slide. So there are many different ways that we can qualify DNA quality. One is by the fragment length. So on average, our nuclear genome is thousands of base pairs long. It's intact. If we look at DNA from missing service members, the DNA is so degraded and fragmented that it might be only 45 base pairs. Very small fragments remain. And this is the same fragmentation level as Neanderthal DNA and Denisovan DNA. We can also look at patterns of DNA damage, and these are similar between ancient samples and those from the punch bowl unknowns. Next slide. What is very, very, very important to our work is that human DNA proportion in these bones is very, very small and even less than ancient DNA. So instead of in the bone sample, when we extract the DNA, instead of it being mostly human, is actually mostly microbial, bacterial, or fungal DNA that remains in those bones that are buried in these disinterred samples. So unfortunately, that means we have a very difficult time enriching for our DNA target, even more so than we would if we had ancient samples at hand. So the proportion of human DNA to microbial DNA is very, very small. Next slide. And when we talk about DNA degradation, we can think about it as a piece of string. And this is Dr. McMahon's example that he usually gives. So if we take an intact piece of string, it would be 16 inches long, but we can degrade it into smaller and smaller pieces so that by the end, we have only a ½ inch of DNA that's very degraded. And that's what happens over time from 75 years ago to now. DNA degrades at a pretty steady rate. So that means we have smaller and smaller pieces of DNA to get out of bone samples or teeth. And unfortunately, STRs are larger in target, several hundred base pairs, than the DNA that we have to extract. So this is another reason that we use mitochondrial DNA, because we can look at all those DNA fragments together to report a mitochondrial DNA profile. Next slide. So we've, over the years, through the emerging technologies section, have brought on numerous methods, especially geared towards past accounting DNA sample success. One of these is low copy number YSTR testing. So we use aggressive measures to get at why STRs, because they are such a critical lineage marker that can be so very helpful for solving cases. We also brought online 2 new autosomal STR test kits, which with updated buffers and that are more efficient for autosomal DNA testing. We brought on NGS for mitochondrial DNA, a procedure both for reference samples and a procedure for bone samples. We now have an entire NGS team and an entire group that's focused on just NGS analysis. In 2021, we brought on an even higher throughput NGS instrument to increase the number of samples that we can do each month. In 2022, we validated an ancient DNA extraction protocol called the Dabney extraction method, and this allows us to recover the smallest or most fragmented DNA pieces from samples. And now, currently, we are in the process of completing our SNP validation. Next slide. If we want to think about the Dabney extraction method, just to give you an idea of how this works, let's say that what we want to get in this mix of this party mix is the M&Ms. Well, think of it like a filter. On the left-hand side, the filter will only trap the very large nuts. So you're only left with, you know, the almonds and the cashews, and all the M&Ms flow through the filter. That would be our previous DNA testing method, where you didn't get any M&Ms in the end. On the right-hand side, you see an even smaller, a finer filter here. So we're retaining everything, all the M&Ms and all the nuts. This is what an analogy to our Dabney method. Our Dabney method doesn't lose any DNA fragments that the other methods might lose, those very short and small fragments. Next slide. Our hybridization capture method, this is how we change that proportion of human DNA to microbial DNA. We can increase the proportion of human DNA by doing this capture procedure. It utilizes probes, just like when you go fishing, or baits. So what we do is we create genomic DNA libraries that has DNA from everything extracted. Every fungus that was on the remains, that DNA comes out. So everything is made into a DNA library. Then we throw in the baits, and these baits are specific to human mitochondrial DNA. In this analogy, let's say they're the black jelly beans that my husband and his family really like. So let's say we're just going and fishing with magnets that are special for the black jelly beans. And then we can pull those out from the whole jelly bean mix. And that's kind of what we're doing with our hybridization capture procedure. Out of all of that DNA extract, we're pulling out that target of interest. Next slide. Our NGS success rate has really boosted the number of identifications that have been able to happen from the Punch Bowl, especially those Kakura remains from the Korean War. So if we look at a sample success rate, it's roughly 60% overall from all of the 5,200 samples that have been tested. And when we say sample success rate, what I mean is that this is why it's so important that we work with DPAA, because the anthropologist reconstructing the skeleton is so important. Maybe an arm bone doesn't produce DNA, but the leg bone or femur does. So we can get DNA from almost every individual, although sometimes the sample success rate is a bit, not every sample itself will work. And I believe, running out of time, so let's just skip down to the SNPs. Next slide, please. So right here, I'd like to pause. We are now finishing a validation of a SNP method, and this will open up the pool of references that we can use for DNA-assisted identification. Paternal nieces, for example, right now are not considered viable references, but they will be when SNPs are online sometime next year. Next slide. We've developed 2 different SNP-based capture methods. One has a large number of SNPs, one has a smaller number of SNPs, and we're now in the process of bringing both of those online and finishing that validation summary. Next slide. Let's skip this one. Next slide. So what this means is that we can, from bone samples to references, we can predict relationships up to 4th degree. This is first cousin once removed, and these will have very strong statistical support, much higher statistical likelihood ratios than we get with autosomal STRs. Next slide. I think we can actually, yeah, let's just skip to the end because I'm 1 minute over myself. And last slide, I'll just give you my contact information so that you can let me know. One more. Next slide. Oh, sorry. Anyway, I'll share my email address with you in case there are any DNA specific questions, and I'll be online for the Q&A later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. We'll go ahead and put up your contact information in the after slides after a few presentations, so I apologize for that. Everyone, thanks again to Dr. Marshall. We're going to transition to our conflict-specific briefings. We're going to go into Vietnam War, World War II, then talk about our World War II efforts. First, for the Vietnam War, we're going to have Mr. Dane Magoon, excuse me. Yes, for the Vietnam War, we're going to have Mr. Dane Magoon and Mr. Brad Taylor. Dane, over to you.
All right. Good morning. My name is Dane Magoon, and I am a Vietnam War analyst with the Indo-Pacific Research Directorate's Research Division based out of the Arlington, Virginia office. Today, I'm presenting an operational update on research and analysis operations for the Vietnam War accounting effort. It is an honor to be with you here today. Next slide, please. For the Vietnam War, our analysts and historians work to provide families with the most current and up-to-date information that is available for a case. We conduct in-depth analysis on each case using multiple sources, and in a lot of ways, this is like cold case detective work. We also support the families by providing this information to you about your missing loved ones. Next slide, please. Our work, however, is not nearly as linear as we would like it to be. While we would like to have the perfect witness take us to the right spot and find incident-related materials right off the bat, things usually don't end up working out that way. Instead, what we have found is that our efforts are often cyclical in terms of having to repeat these processes over and over again. For our unresolved incidents, the case files for Vietnam are robust and reflect decades of research. We're now focused on trying to identify the gaps in our case files, looking for those pieces of information which are needed for case advancement and lead development. And we tend to look for that information in a variety of different locations. It could be witness interviews, site investigation work, site survey work, things that are conducted both in the archives and also in the field. All this information feeds back into the research and analysis process, and we continue this effort until cases are either resolved or the remains are determined to be unrecoverable. The goal of our casework, therefore, is to move cases to a different point in the process. We like to refer to this as case advancement. One of the things that we do with our active case status cases is that when we do have viable leads, we propose investigation work in the field. We develop investigation proposals, and when those are approved, they are listed on the master investigation list, also referred to as the MIL. From that point on, those cases are advanced in the field, and We conduct our research, and based on the findings we have from the field, whether they're witness interviews or site survey work, our next goal is to get those onto the master excavation list if they warrant or merit recovery. And we go through an excavation merit evaluation process. We develop an excavation proposal. And so even though it's cyclical, our goals are to push things towards the mill and also to the mill over time. Next slide, please. This slide provides a fairly good overview of the diverse array of sources that we tap into for case advancement. In the field, we do joint investigation work, which is when we conduct witness interviews and conduct site survey work with DPAA team members and also host nation personnel. Moving to the right, imagery is also an important part of the process. We use aerial imagery to verify and refute crash site locations. And we also look at modern aerial imagery to look at current site conditions as well, to verify whether they've been impacted by development or changed over time. Further to the right, moving in a clockwise direction, family members are actually important to the process because they often have information that is not contained within our case files. And I've had a couple of cases where family members knew more about critical points in a loss incident than we had information for. Often that came from US veterans. Wartime reporting, of course, is extremely important. That usually consists of looking at after action reports and post-incident reporting from the time of the conflict. Unilateral investigations are also important because we have people working for us, usually host nation personnel, when we're not in the field. That could be archival research and also conducting site investigation work as well as witness interviews for us. It helps streamline the process, especially over the last few years with COVID. Our counterparts were able to do things that we couldn't get to do. Veterans, of course, are extremely important. We get information from Vietnamese veterans as well as US veterans, which help us advance cases. Archival research is also critical, and we tend to hit a number of different archives for the information collection process. And we also collect oral history. This could be from foreign military officials, veterans, and we get more general accounts of their longer term involvement in the conflict. And sometimes those efforts have provided us with little bits of information that we've been able to put together for advancement of cases. So it's a kind of a complex and extended process, but we pull lines of information wherever they are because we need to move the cases forward, and this is our basic process and ways of doing it. Next slide, please. For archival research in the US, we typically look at military and government archives, we look at online resources as well, and also books and magazines and articles written about the war itself. In the upper right-hand corner, we have the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington, DC. That's where we look at deck logs and ship log records for naval losses. If we look down towards the lower left, there's the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, Missouri. This is where personnel files are kept. But by far and away, where we do most of our research for the Vietnam conflict is at the National Archives at College Park, often referred to as NARA-2. And this is where the bulk of reporting is kept. It could be command chronologies, after action reports, but this is where we do most of our research. It's also our access point to remote aerial imagery holdings. And so this is a critical place for us. And of course, it's in College Park and it's not far from Arlington, Virginia, so it works out pretty well. I'd also like to point out that a number of universities, including Texas Tech is a good example, have been accumulating and putting lots of information related to the Vietnam conflict online, and that's accessible to the public. And if you're interested, I recommend going through it. Next slide, please. As far as archival research in Southeast Asia goes, the Vietnamese were the real record keepers of the war. Most of the archival information collected in Southeast Asia related to the war has therefore come from Vietnam. Our Vietnamese counterparts have turned over thousands of documents, which we've reviewed and keep on file. There's a very important lists that were kept: burial records, shoot down lists, POW reporting, and starting, these efforts began really in earnest in 1992, and they continue to through the present. And from our counterparts, we're still continuing to receive new documents and work our way through them for case advancement. In Laos, most of the military accounting from Laos was actually maintained by the Vietnamese. So when they returned home, those records went with them. We do attempt to conduct archival research in Laos, but the amount of materials are relatively limited. And usually we end up referring back to the Vietnamese accounts, but we still sustain these efforts and hope that we're going to find more. In comparison, there's very little archival materials available for Cambodia. Next slide, please. Our field investigation work efforts are typically comprised of witness interviews and site investigation work, which usually involves site survey. This is when we go out and we talk to people with firsthand information regarding the incidents and sites, and we also identify, record, and survey sites that may be incident-related locations. Based on the collected information, sites that we believe warrant additional work are evaluated through our excavation merit evaluation process, which is part of that process of moving from the mill to the mell. For most cases, however, it often takes multiple investigation efforts until we get to a point where we can actually correlate a specific site to a specific loss incident. So there's a lot of repetition in what we do. We have a variety of different teams that do go out into the field. We have our joint teams that conduct research and investigation work. We have unilateral teams that are staffed by host nation personnel. We have terrestrial teams versus underwater investigation teams. It all depends on where the sites are located and what's our best way of getting at them. Next slide, please. Aside from our host nation counterparts, there are also other entities that DPAA has collaborated with for the advancement of Vietnam War losses, both in terms of archival research and also in the field. A good amount of human source collection work is conducted by Stony Beach. This is a program run by DIA, and Brad Taylor will be speaking about their contributions to this effort in a few minutes, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. With regards to wartime aerial imagery, assistance has also been provided to DPAA and predecessor agencies by the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. And this is a good segue to talk a little bit about aerial imagery analysis. For DPAA, imagery information is typically focused on the collection of wartime imagery, such as pre- and post-incident imagery of alleged crash site locations. And modern imagery, we can also use that to see, what's the current condition of the site. It should be noted that aerial imagery is not a panacea for case advancement, however. Heavy jungle canopy can often affect local site conditions, and inclement weather often impacted collection efforts. And aerial imagery is, while it's useful for identifying and looking at aircraft crash sites, it's not really useful for looking at burial locations because they're so small. Even when aerial imagery is available for a given date range and a given site location, we often find that the resolution of the imagery or the angle of collection is not sufficient for case advancement. However, when all these variables do line up, like the example shown here, where you can see in the pre-incident imagery, no crash site, and the post-incident imagery, where there is a crash site, you can see why we do pursue this line of material evidence when it's warranted and as it is available. I'd also like to point out that DPAA Partnerships is expanding its presence within Southeast Asia in terms of recent field investigation work and recovery operations, and they'll cover that in their section of the brief. And there's also a number of specialized archival research projects which they're involved in, which also affect and expedite our efforts in the field as well. Next slide, please. Considering the nature of this meeting and the individual losses that the families will be discussing with the case analysts throughout the course of the day, it is important to review how cases are categorized at DPAA, as well as how we review them. Twice a year, the Southeast Asia section gets together between the DC, Arlington, and Hawaii offices, along with Stony Beach representatives. And we go through all of the cases where field work has been conducted within the course of the last year. We also look at cases in deferred status and non-recoverable status that have not been looked at within the last 2-year period. During the course of these meetings, which typically last about a week, we go through about 300 to 350 cases. And during that process, the analyst who holds the case provides a summary of recent work on the case and proposes new lead lines for case advancement, which are coordinated and approved by the group. This is the window where if a recent survey has been conducted and we found a site and we think it's good to pursue for recovery operations, this is when that recommendation would be made for excavation proposal development. Of course, these efforts are often cyclical because we end up reinvestigating cases time and time again as we try to push them forward. But just to throw this out there, even if a case is listed as no further pursuit or non-recoverable or in deferred status, we do look at them on a 2-year window. Cases are also held in 3 different statuses, which I've kind of alluded to here. Active pursuit status refers to cases where we have sufficient information to keep them going. We have viable case leads and we're actively going after them. Deferred status is that point where we've exhausted all the case leads that we know, but we keep it in a semi-active status because we're ready for other leads to come up, whether that's through archival research or chance discoveries and things like that. In contrast, the non-recoverable cases are ones that we believe that the remains have been destroyed or can no longer be recovered, especially under current circumstances. Good examples of this are deep water losses that we can't access at the present, sites that have been built over to the point where we cannot access them, and also sites where construction activities and maybe a good example would be mining, where we know where a site took place, we know that this is where a crash site or burial location was formerly located, and it's been strip mined to the point where there's nothing left to find. But we always keep these things open for potential chance discoveries as well. And technically a case is never closed unless an identification takes place. Next slide, please. This is a good segue for reviewing case summary reports. The case summary report is a document which is prepared for the families, and it summarizes all of the information that is available for the case at this point in time. The first section provides a brief summary overview of the loss incident. The next two sections provide a chronological overview of the field and investigation work conducted by DPAA and predecessor agencies. And following that, there's a analytical summaries, analytical conclusions section, and then finally a next steps section where we present the coordinated lead lines for each case. If a case is in deferred or non-recoverable status, that will be detailed in the analytical conclusions and the next steps sections. If your case is in active pursuit status, you will see coordinated lead lines and task lines, which are saying what we're going to do next for the case. And I strongly recommend if you have a case where there's ongoing field work taking place to, continue to contact the SCOs and plan on attending the annual meeting and other events that fall within the FMU cycle so that you can receive these on a current basis and keep current with your case. Next slide, please. We have 3 different detachments in Southeast Asia. Of course, one in Hanoi, Vietnam, one in Vientiane in Laos, and one in Bangkok in Thailand. And these are critical hubs for our field work in Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. For Vietnam operations, we typically plan 4 activities, joint field activities or JFAs per year, each fiscal year. Mission planning for Vietnam follows the specific weather patterns that occur in the country throughout the course of that window. The northern missions, the first mission of the year is typically up in the north to avoid the monsoons in the south. The other missions in the year tend to avoid the north to avoid the monsoons that take place up there. And our 3rd and 4th cycle JFAs typically take place in the Central Highlands region, just because that's where we have our most concentration of unresolved loss incidents. We have a team in the field. We actually have a JFA which just started, the 24-1 VN JFA departed just recently. We have a number of teams in the field. We have 3 DPAA teams doing recovery operations. We have a DPAA investigation team. In addition, we have 2 unilateral recovery teams as well as a host nation investigation team in the field as well. So we're pretty busy at the moment. Just to give you like a summary standpoint, we have 148 approved cases on the mill for Vietnam, 53 approved sites on the master excavation list, and most of those sites are located in Quang Binh. So we have a lot of work to do. Next slide, please. Operations in Laos follow similar considerations as in Vietnam based on weather patterning. So we tend to move about through the country throughout the course of the fiscal year. We typically plan 5 JFAs per year, and we do have a team that's in the field. We have a JFA which just recently headed over to Laos at the end of October. We have 3 DPAA recovery teams in the field, and we also have a pre-deployment site survey team doing investigation level work, and that's a DPAA partnership team staffed by DPAA personnel, partner personnel, and host nation personnel as well. And looking at the number of cases that we have active, we have 36 approved cases on the master investigation list for Laos, and we also have 65 approved recovery sites on the MEL at this point in time. Next slide, please. And in Cambodia, we typically run 2 joint field activities per year, but this year we have 3. They're all partnership projects, which shows the increased footprint of the partnerships initiative within the Vietnam War conflict losses. The number of cases in Cambodia is relatively small compared to Laos and Vietnam. We have 8 approved cases on the master investigation list at this point in time, and 5 approved sites on the MEL for Cambodia, with 1 currently open. Next slide, please. In summary, our team of researchers, analysts, and historians develop effective investigation leads and identify site locations for case advancement to help push each case forward in order to find and recover remains in the field, which lead to the identification of our missing service members. In addition, we also provide all this information to you in concise case summary reporting, which is conveyed through your service casualty officer. And in meeting contexts and settings like this, we review those reports with you on a one-to-one basis. For the Vietnam conflict, DPAA has had 4 identifications in FY23 and 2 in FY22. So as you can see, we have a lot of work to do, and we definitely want to increase those numbers in the coming years. Next slide, please. Oh, that was my outro slide. Just wanted to say this concludes my briefing, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean. We're going to move next to Mr. Brad Taylor, from the Defense Intelligence Agency, Stony Beach team. Brad, over to you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and it's great to be with you. I am the chief of the Defense Intelligence Agency's Stony Beach team, and primarily today I'm going to be focusing my remarks to those who may not be as familiar with Stony Beach and provide you with a very, very brief overview so you know who we are, what we do, and you know that we are working on your behalf. Next slide, please. So this is our mission statement, and I will briefly just focus on the first 3 words and the last 3 words of this statement. Our focus, our immediate focus, is to gather and report information. Now, we're not immediately focused on the recovery of remains. Now, if the information that we gather and report leads to the recovery of remains, then that's obviously a big success. But it's not our immediate focus. We fit in to the accounting community by gathering and reporting information. Lastly, we are dedicated solely and focused on the Vietnam War mission. And we have a number of reasons for this, but we do not have a capability to support the other wars and conflicts. Next slide, please. This is our team. I mentioned it's very small. You can see how small it is. There are 7 of us, 5 of whom operate in the field. We have 1 who is permanently assigned to the U.S. Embassy in Vientiane, Laos, and we have 4 who are permanently based out of Hawaii. Now, our folks in Hawaii, they conduct frequent trips into Vietnam and in some cases Cambodia, where they operate. One of those positions in Hawaii is a new position. It is our chief of operations position. And we have determined that we needed somebody to dedicate their time and their efforts on focusing on operations. I'm not able to do that exclusively with my duties, so we developed this position, and it's working out very well. But we also have myself in Washington, D.C. and someone else who helps us support operations from our headquarters. Next slide, please. And this is what makes up a Stony Beach specialist. This is all of the training that is required of us. First of all, we're linguists. We conduct interviews in the foreign language. So we need to have a very high level of proficiency so that we can do those interviews. We are trained interviewers or strategic debriefers. Some of us have military attaché training so that we know how to interact with our counterparts. And of course, as was mentioned earlier, we have to have knowledge of the remaining 1,578 Vietnam War POW MIA individuals. I'll say that rather than cases. These are cold cases. These are absolutely cold cases. And to put things in perspective, a typical cold case investigator is assigned 1, maybe 2 cases. We have 1,578. It's a daunting task. We also need to be historians. We need to know the Vietnam War and the accounting mission history. Next slide, please. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm out of time. I just wanted to briefly provide you that overview so that you know who we are and what we do. I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have during the question and answer session. Thank you for your attention, and I hope to meet all of you in person someday. Thanks.
Thank you, Brad. Next, we're going to have Dr. Jim Rose speak to us all about our efforts for the Korean War. Dr. Rose, over to you.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Jim Rose. I will be talking to you about the Korean War research, recovery, and identifications. I am a disinterment historian that works at Nebraska, one of our satellite facilities out there. And we're also going to be joined by Dr. Veronica Keys, who works for the Korean War Identification Project. Next slide, please. Here's a quick agenda of what we'll be talking about today. We'll go over the number of unaccounted for servicemen, where they were lost, the Korean War research that DPA is conducting. We'll also talk about Korean War recoveries and identifications, and the identifications in the calendar year 2023 so far. Our FY24 field operation goals in the Republic of Korea, South Korea, our Cold War recovery operations, how families can help, and a brief overview of the Korean War Identification Project. Next slide, please. So here's our general numbers, 7,487. I'm always nervous to put this number up on a slide because we do this several weeks in advance. And these numbers are always very dynamic for us with identifications made sometimes the day of our briefings. So these numbers are always changing, which is a good thing. To the left of this slide, you can see how the casualties are broken down by their status at the end of the war, whether they were killed in action, unknown prisoner of war, missing in action, or non-battle deaths. And to the right, you can see the casualties by service, with the Army having more casualties than the others. Next slide, please. Think of the Korean Peninsula as three general areas. This is how we view it. And so this is North Korea. To the top left, you can see the POW camp burial sites. Roughly 1,200 unresolved casualties are associated with these areas, with the big one being Camp 5. Excuse me. To the bottom left, you see Unsong Chonchon area with roughly 1,500 unresolved casualties. That correlates to the battles fought by the 1st Cavalry Division and the 2nd Infantry Division, along with other elements of 8th Army. And to the top right, you can see the Chosin Reservoir area with roughly 1,000 casualties unresolved today. And that deals with the 1st Marine Division and other elements of 10th Corps, such as the 7th Infantry Division and the 3rd Infantry Division. Next slide, please. As we move down the peninsula, we tend to think of the DMZ as its own separate area. And that's because that requires special access into that area, and it can also be tense at times for us to conduct operations in there. And so we are looking at battles in there, such as the Jamestown Line battles, Arrowhead, Pork Chop Hill, Old Baldy, Iron Triangle, and Punch Bowl Bloody Ridge. These areas were fought over between 1951 and 1953. If you think about World War I type fighting, this is what we were seeing here at this time of the war. Next slide, please. And then we move further down the peninsula. And so this is South Korea. And there are several major areas in South Korea that we run operations in because they were major battles. If we go to the bottom right corner, you can see the Pusan perimeter. This was held by the 8th Army at the beginning of the war. And those battles were mostly fought between July, August, and September of 1950. Moving slightly up the map, we see the Taejon area. There was a large battle there in July 1950 by the 24th Infantry Division, and a lot of POW routes from the southern parts, especially the Pusan perimeter, passed through that area. And then as we move further up the slide, you can see the Seoul area. And so that applies to not only the Incheon landing in September 1950 and the battle for Seoul, but also battles to retake Seoul after the Chinese entered the war and had taken it a second time. Next slide, please. So what does DPA do as far as research and analysis? We also go to the National Archives, as you've already heard a couple times before. National Archives 2 College Park, Maryland is where we find the war diaries and record group 407. We also look at record group 92, the Quartermaster General records for graves registration documentation. We do run a veterans oral history program where we interview veterans either at their home or during unit conventions. We go to service history centers and libraries. We also go to the National Personnel Records Center down there for the official military personnel files in St. Louis, and that is also where the morning reports are held for their units. We've gone to the Library of Congress. We go to foreign archives to include the People Liberation Army archives in China. And then we also plug all of this into our geographic information system that allows us to build layers on maps and to take a lot of this data and create it in a map that allows us to visualize and analyze how they overlap on each other. Next slide, please. So we'll talk a little bit about recoveries. There were recoveries all throughout the 60s and 80s where our allied partners in South Korea would find an individual or be led to a location where there was an individual, and those individuals would come back to us through the Yokohama mortuary in Japan. But the big returns started in the 1990s. So for 1990 to 1994, the North Koreans negotiating with us turned over 208 sets of transfer cases. And you can see the photographs of them coming across the DMZ and the honor ceremonies bringing them to Hawaii. Once these 208 transfer cases reached Hawaii and they were reviewed by the scientists, it was determined that there was over 400 individuals contained within those transfer cases. And as of today, well, as of the day of these slides, 192 of these individuals have been accounted for. And again, this is a dynamic number. I always get a little nervous about these numbers because over the last couple of weeks, more identifications could have been made. Next slides, please. At the end of the K208 turnovers, part of the discussions was it would be more efficient if we went into North Korea and recovered these remains. There are roughly 5,300 US personnel still missing in North Korea, and this would help us with the identification process if we were able to actually send our archaeologists and anthropologists to the site to dig. And they agreed to do that between 1996 and 2005. And so we went to places like the Unsan Battle Area and the Chosin Reservoir. And from those areas, 229 sets of remains were recovered. Many have been identified, and some are still undergoing analysis in the DPA laboratory. Unfortunately, these operations had to be suspended in May of 2005 as the tensions heightened on the peninsula and continue to stay at a heightened level. It looked like there was going to be a breakthrough in 2012, and DPA started putting equipment in place, started training people preparing to go back. But again, political tensions overrode that, and that trip was canceled. But DPA is ready to go. If we were to get the go-ahead from State Department and higher DOD, our leaders would come to us and say, we're going to do this and we're ready to go if that opportunity presents itself. Next slide, please. And again, in 2018, during negotiations with North Korea, they were willing to turn over additional transfer cases of human remains to us, and this took place in Wonsan, North Korea on 27 July 2018. These remains were accessioned to the DPA laboratory on 1 August 2018, and it was 55 sets for containers with remains and material artifacts. One of these artifacts was a identification tag, also known as a dog tag, for a U.S. Army 8th Cavalry Regiment casualty from the Unsan area. With each set of remains, the North Koreans provided a recovery location, which helps us in doing our historical analysis. To date, 90 of these individuals have been accounted for, and they come from the Chosin, Unsan, and Kujang area of North Korea. Next slide, please. So we know we can't do additional operations in North Korea right now, but that does not mean that we're not continuing to work on North Korea cases, whether it's the K208 or the K55. And in this case, the unknown's buried in Hawaii. And so on the left of that screen, you can see the DPRK phases for North Korea. These are all of the unknowns after the war that were buried in Hawaii. It's broken into two different groups, those recovered in North Korea and those recovered in South Korea. They are being disinterred in 7 distinct phases. We are currently working on phase 5. For North Korea, you can see phase 1 was the cemeteries. At that point, we only had 1 cemetery left to still disinter from the punch bowl, so that's why you only see 9 unknowns in that phase. Phase 2 was the POW camps, camps 1 and 3 and camps 5. Phase 3 and 4 were the chosen reservoir, and so we have disinterred all the unknowns that were reportedly recovered from the chosen reservoir. And we're currently in phase 5, which is a large group of isolated burials. Moving over to the South Korea side, we were trying our best to work our way up both in time and in geography up the peninsula. So phase 1 was in the Masan area, which is the very bottom of that area, and as far south as you can get in the Busan perimeter and still be in Korea. Phase 2 was dealing with the unknowns recovered from the Daejeon battles in July of 1950, though we think there's some POWs mixed in there. And phase 3 and 4 complete the Busan perimeter fights. And so these first 4 phases are really the very first casualties suffered by US Army forces. We're talking July, August, and September of 1950. And we are now getting into phase 5, which is near the Seoul area of South Korea. And this has casualties mostly from the Incheon landing and the battle for Seoul, and probably some POWs. And so we will be finished with that by the end of this fiscal year. And then phase 6 and 7 is mostly along the DMZ area. Next slide, please. This is the history of our disinterment operations. Originally started in 1999, and as you've heard from some of the previous briefs, there was issues with extracting DNA from these remains. Always seen as a challenge, not as a full stop on our operations. And so we continue to find ways to exploit the evidence that was available, whether that was fingerprints, dental charts. And so you can see over the years, we were able to, a couple here and there. And then the laboratory developed the chest radiograph matching as a means of making identification. And that allowed us to increase the number of unknowns that we were disinterring. As you heard from the AFME's AFDIL brief, 2015 NGS came online and allowed us to be more successful in DNA extraction from the remains, and our numbers start growing. And then thanks to the number of family members who had submitted DNA for us, we were able to go to the approval authority and say, we've been very successful. We think we should do this as a larger project. And they agreed, and that's how the 7 phases came about. And that is where we are now, operating in the 7 phases. Again, these numbers are always very dynamic. The number 8 you see at the very end for 2023, that changes Monday. We will disinter 8 more as long as it's sunny, and that number will turn to 16. Next slide, please. So what have we done this year? And here we're talking calendar year, and you can see I've plotted the identifications that were made in 2023. 15 of those identifications came from unknowns that were buried in temporary UNMC cemeteries. And you can see that they pretty much correspond with some of the maps I showed you earlier, whether that's the Masan area at the very bottom of the tip of Korea, or a little further up in the Daejeon area of Korea, and then in Seoul. 10 unknowns came from the Operation Glory returns in 1954. And they also correspond with the areas we talked about earlier, with the POW camps at the far left and the chosen reservoir at the top right. 3 of those identifications were K-55 unilateral turnovers from 2018, and again, come from the chosen reservoir area. And 2 of those were Macri recoveries. And they're the cross swords icons on the far right of the screen, about the middle of the country. There was a lot of Rock Army units fighting in that area. And so they are there looking for their casualties and find ours at the same time. Next slide, please. For FY24 operation plans, Our team has 3 investigations planned. 2 of those are terrestrial, and 1 is an underwater mission planned for South Korea operations. And there is a potential for 1 recovery team, where we would send a team out to the site to excavate. The big news for us in the Korea team is that FY23 had the first open water underwater investigation mission. And as technology advances and our discussions with our allies in South Korea, ability to go out into the water and look for some of what we would consider the really hard cases in the past are now becoming more viable. Next slide, please. So I talked a little bit about Macri recovering 2 individuals that we were able to identify this year. Macri stands for the Ministry of National Defense Agency for KIA Recovery and Identification. It's a mouthful. They were established in 2007, and they have been a huge force multiplier for us. Even though they're looking for their own people, they are finding ours on occasion because we tended to fight side by side. And so they will locate witnesses, accompany and facilitate DPA teams' movements in South Korea, provide information if possible, and as we've discussed earlier, actually recover our individuals. And when they do that, they will reach out to us and we will send a team to their laboratory to do a review. And they're also conducting DMZ demining operations in conjunction with the North Koreans. And we're hoping that will open up more of the DMZ for our own operations in the future. Next slide, please. We are also responsible for Cold War cases. DPA continues to work to resolve these cases. There's 10 in the former Soviet Union, 1 in Armenia, 1 in Laos, and 4 in China and North Korea. We have successfully found several of these sites in the past and have accounted for over 20 personnel from the Cold War losses. Next slide, please. And at this point, I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Veronica Keys if she is available and online.
Thank you, Dr. Rose. I am available and I am happy to talk to you all this afternoon. My name is Dr. Veronica Keys and I am the Korean War Identification Project lead in the DPA laboratory. So we work very closely with the historians doing all this research that Dr. Rose was just talking about. The Korean War Identification Project team consists of 13 analysts, including myself, who are working solely on Korean War accounting. So the project encompasses all Korean War accounting, and we're doing analysis on all of those sources of remains that Dr. Rose mentioned. We've made 672 identifications to date through our laboratory, and we have just started with the phase 5 disinterment. So those began in October, and we will have another set of remains being disinterred this coming Monday. So the phase 5 remains, as they come out of the Punchbowl Cemetery, is brought into the laboratory, and the Korean War Identification Project team then does all of the cleaning of the remains, any assessments, and then develops a course of action for the analysis for each of those cases. So since we have begun the phased disinterment plan, a lot of our work has revolved around, doing that intake when the remains come into the lab, and then continuing to follow up with those cases as new lines of evidence are returned. So when we get DNA results, or if we do the chest radiograph comparison that Dr. Rose mentioned, or dental comparisons, and then we can put all of those lines of evidence together and make an association to a service member. But outside of the Punchbowl cases, we are still working on the remains from these other sources, such as the K208 and the K55 remains that were turned over from the DPRK, and any remains that we receive through repatriation with Macri. And so those cases are also being actively worked. And a lot of the remains that we still have in the laboratory from those turned over remains or from the joint recovery operations are some of our more challenging cases where we have some pieces of information missing, so we haven't been able to make an identification. So this slide here, how families can help, these things are some of the things that the families can do that can help us resolve some of those cases that we haven't been able to identify. So DNA references are incredibly important for us. If we have remains that we've been able to get a DNA sequence from the remains, if we don't have a DNA reference on file from the family member, then we will be missing that association to the service member. So DNA references from family are incredibly important. And then we also use any other information that we can get. So if there are any letters or photographs of the service member, those can help us strengthen our associations to a particular service member, and any health records, medical records, dental records, anything of that nature, or even, anecdotal stories of past injuries or anything about the health information of the service member can also help us link a set of remains to a service member if we have that information. So all of these things are incredibly helpful to us, and we will continue to work on these cases and try to continue making these identifications so that we can send your loved ones home. Thank you.
Thank you to both Dr. Rose and Dr. Keys. Before we transition to our next speaker, whether you're watching from our dpa.mil website, YouTube, Facebook, or LinkedIn, just appreciate everyone for joining us. Go ahead and drop in your questions or comments, anything you may want to ask during the Q&A session into the chat box of the respective webpage. Reminder, anything case specific for your loved one, let's save that for your one-on-one case summary review with the service casualty officer and analyst. All right, we're going to transition on to Dr. Kyle Bracken. He'll speak to all of us about our efforts concerning World War II. Dr. Bracken, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'll take a second and wait for my slides to come up here. My name is Kyle Bracken. I'm the Chief of Research for World War II Pacific. My job is I supervise one of our 2 World War II Pacific research teams. And so one of our 2 teams of historians and archaeologists that work on all of our World War II Asia and Pacific cases. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk about today is our 3 primary ways of resolving our World War II cases, our paths to recovery and identification. Always, it starts with historical research. That's always the first step in anything that we do. And then we'll talk about our field investigations and recoveries, and also our disinterment efforts to identify the unknowns. Next slide, please. So as you can see, there were over 400,000 US total casualties from the Second World War. And now we have roughly 72,000 that are still unresolved. And by that means that the Graves Registration Service was not able to affect a positive identification of the remains recovered, or remains that were just not recovered at all. So you can see the percentage on the chart here of those recovered, those buried at sea, that 2%, which count as resolved casualties, compared to what we have that we're still trying to resolve now. Next slide, please. So Graves registration really evolved over the course of the Second World War. During the wartime, your initial recovery of American dead were conducted by unit level Graves registration forces, or details drawn from from frontline combat units. So depending on what the battlefield looked like, this could be a pretty organized effort to a pretty ad hoc and chaotic affair, especially early on in the war when the United States was not prepared for the number of casualties that it was going to be sustaining in these early phases of the war. And it wasn't until the end of the war that the American Graves Registration Service in the Pacific and Asia and the Mediterranean and the American Graves Registration Command in Europe started taking control of graves registration operations, recovery of dead, managing of American military cemeteries throughout the world. So there's a great deal of variance between what we see on the battlefield recovering war dead in, say, 1942 versus what the AGRS is doing in 1946, 1947. Next slide, please. The temporary cemeteries are really interesting. This is of course, our map of the Asia Pacific area. And you can see the crosses on here that identify different cemeteries. And the reason that some are larger than others is, and this really shows that differentiation between what graves registration activities looked like early on in the war versus later on. So that really ad hoc affair that's happening on the battlefield, in a lot of cases, the graves registration forces are just trying to get deceased personnel into graves to clear the battlefield, and so that combat operations can continue. So in some cases, remains were buried and exhumed and reburied several times throughout the war before they end up in a place like the Punch Bowl Cemetery in Hawaii or the American Military Cemetery in Manila in the Philippines. So to give you an example, a soldier from the 32nd Infantry Division who was killed at Buna in Papua New Guinea in November 1942 could have possibly, in a few examples, would have been buried in an isolated burial with 2 or 3 or 5 of their comrades, and then exhumed, buried in the Garua Gardens Cemetery, which is a larger local cemetery, exhumed again, buried in the Buna Cemetery when that's established, exhumed again and moved to the Saputo Cemetery, then to one of the 5 Finchhofen cemeteries before they finally leave New Guinea and are buried again in Manila. The point of this is an effort to consolidate and organize and make sure that all of the remains being collected on the battlefield are accounted for. But oddly enough, this is what contributed to a lot of the chaos in terms of trying to identify remains down the road. As they're exhumed and moved around, bodies were mixed up, bones were commingled, and in some cases, the AGRS completely lost track of one or more sets of remains. So you do have in cases remains that were collected and buried and accounted for that are now considered unresolved. Next slide, please. So we have 3 methods of case progression that are all interdependent. With that, one doesn't really succeed without the other: the historical research, our disinterment work, and our field operations. We're going to talk about each of those a little bit independently. Next slide, please. So historical records, I mentioned that historical research is the first thing that we have to do to advance any of these cases. That starts with concentrating on archival collections. That's wartime documents that were compiled during and the years after the Second World War. And we're going to talk about specifically a little bit of those that we focus on primarily over the next few slides. A lot of that for us is getting to the archives, collecting these documents, and digitizing them and making them accessible to everybody back in the office where we're doing all of our case progression work. We depend a lot on new discoveries. That's witnesses that we might find in the field. when we're conducting investigation operations. That's aircraft wreckage, anything new that perhaps the AGRS couldn't accomplish themselves during the war is always going to be then reintegrated back into our research procedure. And this is kind of a continuum where we're always bringing in new pieces of information, and that contributes to how we develop our cases. And of course, new technology. You're going to hear a lot today about the technology used to to advance recoveries. Of course, you're going to hear about the scientific work that our lab is doing to actually make identifications. But for us, on the research side, a lot of the new technology that we're working on is geospatial related, using GIS to take these historical documents that we're working with and find a functional way to use them in the field. And in some ways, that's using wartime maps or wartime imagery. We're going to talk about that a little bit over the course of the next few slides as well. But all three of these things, of these primary components here, all factor into the development of our case narratives and the information that we use to advance cases for field investigation, for recovery, or to get approval for disinterment of unknowns. Next slide, please. So one of the biggest setbacks that we deal with a lot is in 1973 at the National Personnel Records Center, which houses the official military personnel files of every serviceman from the Second World War. And the fire in 73 destroyed roughly 80% of the Army's records. And so that's one key piece of information that that we simply don't have for a lot of our missing service members. So one of the things that we're doing all the time is trying to find different sources, different record groups, different repositories of information. So we regularly visit the National Archives and Records Administration in College Park, Maryland. We have researchers up there just about every month, getting up and collecting information on the cases that we're advancing. In addition to the Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, where we're still collecting personnel files for our missing individuals, and as well as in the past have collected all of the individual deceased personnel files from NPRC. Other places that we get to a lot are the Air Force Historical Research Agency in Alabama. We're hitting the presidential libraries pretty often, and foreign archives as well. I know for myself, working on the Southwest Pacific area, we've done a lot of archival work in Australia. So anytime that we're consistently looking for new repositories that have information that might benefit us. Next slide, please. So two documents that at least one of them that you're all pretty much should be familiar with at this point is the individual deceased personnel file. The IDPF is a document that contains all of the information that the Graves Registration Services compiled about an individual who was killed in the Second World War. So that's everything from witness testimony about their loss, information about where they were buried, the analysis that their remains underwent, medical records related to their dentition, their stature, and everything including an inventory of their belongings, correspondence with their families, and the eventual turnover of their remains back to their final resting place. So of course, an IDPF for an individual who was killed and identified and accounted for right away is going to actually contain a lot more information than that from a missing serviceman. Of course, the other file is the OMPF, the Official Military Personnel File, which contains everything about a service member's entire military service. So the best ones of those that I've seen contain everything from their shot records, their physical, their marksmanship qualifications, and then a lot of the same information that's included in the IDPF. But when putting the two of them side by side, if we're fortunate to be able to get both of them, then that's actually there can be information in the OMPF that's beneficial to us that's not in the IDPF. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the IDPF has a variety of different information in it. One of the things I wanted to point out about the IDPFs that's really interesting is while we have for a long time possessed all the IDPFs in digital form for all of our missing service members, we've gotten to collecting the IDPFs for all of the resolved casualties as well. And part of the reason for that is, as I mentioned earlier, we're trying to compile as much information as possible to reconstruct a historical event. In this case, it's the disappearance of an individual in battle, and all of the subsequent efforts to try and resolve that case, to recover and identify their remains. So what we found is that from using the IDPFs from resolved personnel can offer us a lot of extra information. Say if there were 5 soldiers from a particular company who were all killed on the same day, and one of them is unresolved, then all the information surrounding where the other soldiers' remains were recovered can give us a good place to start and give us some more refined information, say when we're fielding an investigation team or when we're comparing individuals against a particular X file, an unknown for potential association in the future. Next slide, please. Other information that's really useful to us, the morning reports, mission reports, war diaries, everything that was compiled by an individual's unit. War diaries, command reports will tell us what individual units were doing on a day-to-day basis. The best ones will provide us with grid coordinates for locations where particular units were located on an individual day. Some of these reports are broken down by down to the hour. Morning reports are their accountability reports for every day, when a unit will tell you how many soldiers are present for duty that day, how many are sick and not present for duty, and also when individuals are killed or missing after a particular engagement. And that's a pretty voluminous set of information. And the National Personnel Record Center is actually in the process of digitizing all of the morning reports from the Second World War and the Korean War. That's going to be a pretty lengthy process for them to do that, but that's something that we can look forward to in the future. And in addition to the stuff that's in the IDPFs, the AGRS and AGRC did compile their own reports about their activities, which are consistently useful to us. And the missing aircrew reports, which I'll talk about on the next slide, please. So missing aircrew report is in some ways like an IDPF, but for an aircraft. So what a macro report will tell us is everything surrounding the loss of an aircraft. The day that an aircraft took off, its destination, where it left from, where it was headed, what the weather conditions were like, and also, most importantly for us, who was on board each aircraft. Whether not just the air crew, but for certain types in, say, air transport units, if there were other people that were traveling along with the air crew, say on a C-47 or on a transport aircraft. And the best missing aircrew reports that we've got will tell us information about the serial numbers on the engines that were installed on the aircraft, the serial numbers on any weapon systems that are on there. And so when we're out in the field and come across a crash site and say find a 50 caliber machine gun with a visible serial number on it, we can use that information and reference it against a missing aircrew report in order to determine exactly which aircraft that is that we're looking at. We'll talk about that a little bit going forward. Next slide, please. Operational records, I mentioned, come in many different forms, and like anything else, it's kind of a toss-up about how useful some of these records are. The example we've got on here is from the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal. I've always liked working on Marine Corps records, mainly because the Marines kept pretty excellent records about, in my experience, for their troops in the field. And so one of the great examples here is this overlay map on the right that shows the disposition of a particular battalion of Marines on a specific day in January 1943, where you can actually see the breakdown of each company. So what we can do is take that information, and especially in terms of field investigations, that gives us a really great piece of information to target our investigation in the field. Because even a place like Guadalcanal, which is a comparatively very small island to a lot of the other places that we work on, is still a tremendous area for an investigation team to try and work in, with a lot of ground to cover. Next slide, please. So you can see here an example of us using the geospatial technology and using those operational records, where we've taken that very same overlay from the last slide and geo-rectified it across a present day map. So now, within a certain margin of error, we can go out onto the battlefield on Guadalcanal, and as far as the accuracy of what the Marine Corps reported, we can get out to the area where these particular Marines were fighting on this particular day on 5 January 1943. And that gives us the opportunity to then go out and find fighting positions and try and compare, give us a baseline to compare that against narratives that are cataloged in the operational records and help us guide our investigations. Next slide, please. We also have historical aerial imagery. This is imagery taken by reconnaissance aircrafts. It's a lengthy process for us to collect these images, but at the same time, when we can get them, also like any other document, they are of varying quality. This is a particularly useful image here from Italy, where you get clear imagery. And if we switch to the next slide, you can see that same area, but with a very visible anomaly on that. In this case, there's scarring on the ground. So what we can do is compare images from before and after an incident that we're interested in, and see if there's anything like this on the battlefield. In this case, this did ultimately end up being evidence of a crash site that we were then able to send a recovery to. Aerial imagery is also interesting when you have changes in the landscape over time. When you have things like rivers that might have changed course over the years, it's good for us to be able to have that line of reference when we're consulting different terrain features in the field. Next slide, please. So I mentioned a little bit earlier about new pieces of information that come along. One of the best things that we can get is information from you all out there who are attending these events, who are interested in resolving these cases. Letters and documents, anything that can give us information about the circumstances of somebody's loss. Photos of individuals. We've got this example on the right here of a photo that actually shows this sailor's teeth, which can actually be used for us to compare against the dentition of a set of remains in the lab. And also local witnesses. As part of our field investigation, this is a really useful piece of information when not just meeting people who were alive during the war who give firsthand information, but things like crash sites out in the jungle and say in Papua New Guinea. There are things that's information that's passed on to subsequent generations, or things that people discover later on. So the local population in all the countries we work in is always incredibly helpful and a huge source of information. Next slide, please. So field investigations, we have two primary types of field activities. That's our investigations and our recoveries. And investigations are, I like to say that these are not the culmination of our research. It's another component that we can then feed back into our research. So we compile all that available historical information that we have and put all that together and create a case narrative and a proposal for investigation, and then get out into the field to interview witnesses that can give us information, get out to crash sites, and using things like missing aircrew reports when we get onto a crash site. What we're trying to do is figure out exactly, first what type of aircraft we're looking at, and then additionally trying to get parts numbers and serial numbers off of any evidence that we have out there, and try and use that information to figure out exactly which aircraft, which individual serialized airframe that we're actually looking at in the field. And then from there, compare those against missing aircrew reports, and to determine whether that aircraft has any had any missing individuals aboard it when it crashed. So in those field investigations, if we can successfully do that, I'll use the example of a crash site again, to determine which airframe that we're looking at and find that it's an aircraft that has missing individuals associated with it, then we can use that to then justify sending a full recovery team and conduct an archaeological recovery on that site, which is a much more advanced operation and time consuming. Next slide, please. The last thing we have is the roughly 8,600 unknowns. These are individuals whose remains were recovered, but they could not be identified by the Central Identification Laboratory at the conclusion of the World War II remains recovery efforts. The remains that we have, the X files that we've exhumed and examined in our lab are of varying quality. Sometimes they're commingled, several sets of remains in one casket. Sometimes you have a relatively fully articulated skeleton. And so a lot of that information we find from the actual X file that tells us all that biometric data and gives us a pretty good idea of what those remains are going to look like before they come into the lab. Next slide, please. This just gives you a little bit of a breakdown of what our X-Files situation looks like across the globe. The ABMC cemeteries, the American Battle Monuments Commission, are the overseas cemeteries, places like Normandy and Manila that house U.S. remains. And then, of course, the Veterans Affairs cemeteries like Arlington and the Punch Bowl. Next slide, please. So there's a lengthy process here that remains underwent, first from the type of their recovery and their interment, which as I mentioned, that phase can happen several times if the remains are exhumed. And depending on the timing and the cemetery and the graves registration staff there, they would undergo analysis throughout that entire process, from recovery to interment to exhumation to reinterment, all the way to the point of finally making it to get under a forensic review from anthropological staff that are actually going to do that work of comparing against the dental records, against medical records that report stature and other biometric data, in order to try and make those identifications before they're ultimately identified or receive a finding of unidentifiable. And what unidentifiable, you'll see in X files, will tell us that after this entire process has been completed, if the anthropological staff cannot determine that conclusively that these remains are associated with a particular individual at the conclusion of the whole remains recovery process, those remains were given an unidentifiable designation and continued in an unknown status. Next slide, please. Okay. So what remains had, sorry, the bottom of the slide is cut off here. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, so the different reasons why a set of remains were not identified and ultimately became given that unidentifiable designation. Some of it is depending on what happened at the time of recovery. If the information of a recovery location does not coincide very closely with where a particular individual was last seen, sometimes there's incomplete historical record. In the cases of prisoners of war, sometimes we're dealing with records, inaccurate and inconsistent records compiled by opposing forces. For the anthropological staff, the condition of the remains matters, the completeness of the remains matters. Sometimes there's contradictory identifying media. A set of remains that has a dog tag with it does not necessarily associate a set of remains with that individual. Every soldier in the field is wearing a set of dog tags, and we find information like that, conflicting identifying media on the battlefield even now. Say a set of dog tags that belongs to an individual who was identified during the war, or even sometimes individuals who weren't killed at all. And of course, the limitations of scientific methodology at the time that we're able to advance a lot better now. Next slide, please. So in order for us to identify remains, to identify the X files, we have to compile a disinterment memo that will basically, when we're reconstructing the events surrounding an unknown set of remains recovery and all the efforts to identify it, we'll compile information in order to actually, we switch to the next slide. So I got a better explanation here. So what we'll do is compile all that historical information from all those same records that we've been talking about, and come up with a list of all the potential candidates that we think could be associated with this particular set of unknowns. And that's based from the historians solely off of historical work, historical records, and then our lab staff can make their cuts to that list based off of biometric data. And with that updated list, we then have to, by DoD mandate, have to reach a threshold of 50% family of DNA reference samples. What that means is that of the list of candidates that we come up with between the research staff and the lab staff, we have to have a family reference sample on file for at least half of the people on that list before we actually are authorized to go in and disinter those remains from a cemetery. And that number goes up if we have an X file that represents more than one individual. If we have one casket that has 4 or 5 or more, or any more than one individual commingled remains, that threshold for FRS coverage has to go up to 60%. So that's what we're working with. It's a lengthy process, but having you all here and donating your family reference samples and talking about our work with other members of your family is always helpful for us to advance these disinterment cases. Next slide, please. So this is just covering that same information for the 60% for group burials or commingled unknowns. This information comes from 2015. This policy was established when for the process for exhuming and identifying the sailors from the USS Oklahoma from the Pearl Harbor attack. And so this is the standard that we have to refer to every time that we're writing up our disinterment memos. So on our historical staff, our research staff, we have historians who their entire job is to work on these disinterment cases and produce these memoranda that we use as our justification to exhume unknown burials for identification. And that's in addition to the other historians and archaeologists that are working on cases for development into investigations and other field work. Next slide, please. This shows our disinterment operations over the course of the last several years. I want to point out there that in 2023, fiscal year 2023, we had 513 unknowns exhumed. That's skewed quite a bit by the 430 of them, which represent remains recovered from the Inora Maru prisoner hellship case. So that shot those numbers up quite a bit, but just to give you an idea of where we're at in FY23, you can see the boost up in for the USS Oklahoma unknowns, and then of course as we started our Korean War identification project, you can see those numbers shoot up around 2019 as well. Next slide, please. I just want to thank you all for coming today. It's a pleasure to speak to you, and looking forward to your questions. Thanks again.
Thank you, Dr. Bracken. We're going to move on to our next session. Ms. Hannah Fleming, she's going to talk to us about our partnerships and innovation efforts. Hannah, over to you.
Hello. Thank you for sticking around for this last presentation. My name is Hannah Fleming, and I work for the Henry M. Jackson Foundation as an innovation officer in support of the DPAA, specifically the Partnerships and Innovation Directorate. Today, I'm really honored to be here and to be able to give you all an overview of the Partnerships and Innovations Directorate's work. Slide, please. The Partnerships and Innovation Directorate's objective can be summarized as supporting DPAA's accounting mission by leveraging the capabilities and capacity of external partnerships. These partnerships can be all sorts of entities like other government agencies, academic institutions, nonprofit organizations, museums, and other technical experts, and they can be in all sorts of related fields such as archaeology, underwater archaeology, geophysics, and historical research. Our three main streams for partnered projects are through field missions, that is, investigations and recoveries, research projects, where partners conduct, among other things, foundational research to support the accounting mission, and innovation projects, where we are evaluating novel field, laboratory, and research-based technologies, practices, and procedures. We're very happy to share that DPAA has continued to grow partnered efforts year over year, and that DPAA hit a milestone in 2023 and conducted the 200th partnered field mission in June. Slide, please. Congress authorized the DPAA to undertake partnerships in 2015 and has since developed more than 200 partner relationships. And you may be wondering why DPAA partners. It's because it supplements and supports DPAA's mission by 1, expanding the agency's operational capabilities and capacity, 2, leveraging external resources, and 3, testing and validating cutting-edge methods. Slide, please. These goals are accomplished by acting as the point of contact for current and potential DPAA partners. Each potential partner is carefully vetted for their professional proficiencies and are given DPAA training before being assigned a DPAA project. Partnerships and innovation personnel then work side by side with the external entities throughout the life cycle of the project to accomplish the mission objectives. And finally, the Partnerships and Innovation Directorate supports communications between partners and DPAA personnel from across the agency to ensure DPAA interests are met. I also think it's important to note that our partners are not making identifications. They collect all potential evidence and the agency does the analysis. Next slide, please. Research partners work with our Partnerships and Innovations team of professional historians to support outreach and communications, disinterments, investigations and recoveries, and identification efforts. This can look like standard archival research, but it can also look like mapping projects, casualty database production, photographic archive research, battle overview narratives, or oral history collation, just to give a few examples. Slide, please. Terrestrial field partners work with our Partnership and Innovations team of professional terrestrial archaeologists to conduct field investigations and recoveries around the world. In fiscal year 2023, terrestrial partners conducted 46 missions in 16 countries, with the majority of these being recovery efforts. Slide, please. Similarly, our underwater field partners work with Partnerships and Innovations team of professional underwater archaeologists to conduct field investigations and recoveries. In fiscal year 2023, underwater partners conducted 24 missions in 17 countries around the world. The added technical training and tools required to investigate and excavate underwater also means that underwater is a huge area for innovative improvement within the agency, as we'll see from a partner-produced video in just a couple slides. Many underwater DPAA sites of interest are also accessible only via autonomous vehicle, making this an example of the challenging environments that DPAA works in. Slide, please. Innovation is happening all over the agency all the time. The Partnerships and Innovations innovation space is just one way for DPAA personnel and partners to test and validate innovative techniques. The innovation team consists of professionals from multiple related fields, terrestrial and underwater archaeology, materials science, and data analytics, just as examples. We work with DPAA stakeholders and partners who also run the gambit of the agency's expertise. This is still a new space for the agency, but in fiscal year 2023, 11 innovative processes were tested. In the next slide, we're going to take a look at a dual innovation and underwater operational project conducted in partnership with 2 underwater partners. Slide, please, and can you start the video, please?
$10 meters, slightly off dead ahead.
Yeah, that's looking significant.
And we should be just approaching the large target now.
This is interesting. Okay, this is... That is...
Yep.
This looks like the main wreckage.
Yep.
Yeah, roger.
Sites like this tell a story. It's the location of a tragedy, very likely a spot where service members lost their lives.
You can definitely tell that's the glass cockpit. You can see the reflection of the LED lights in it.
Yep. Service members lost in conflict and combat leave behind friends, families, and, all too often, a mystery of their last resting place. Over 41,000 Americans are presumed lost at sea all around the world. This mission is in partnership with an organization called the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, or DPAA, a division of the Department of Defense charged with providing the fullest possible accounting for military personnel lost while performing their duties.
Our interest is archaeology, but the main task here is to evaluate this site for the possible loss of 2 people on board. That means we're combining a number of aspects to understand this site.
Partnering with organizations like the Ocean Exploration Trust provides the DPAA a unique avenue to explore deepwater areas. EV Nautilus is equipped with advanced technologies to fulfill this mission, including remotely operated vehicles, acoustic mapping sonars, and telepresence capabilities that allow scientists to participate in the mission from anywhere in the world. For this mission, we're working on a site located more than 1,800 feet deep. We're using acoustic sonar and remotely operated vehicles to investigate the site in an effort to correlate information about the wreck and, if possible, provide conclusive evidence of who was lost.
There has to be correlative evidence to point that it is that specific site. The data plates could certainly help with that, but that doesn't guarantee that we will make the correlation.
Wow. Now can we...
Something Aeronautical Corps.
It says Wright Aeronautical,
Wright.
W-R-I-G-H-T.
A project like this takes hundreds of people, thousands of hours, and a lot of recommendations. We were very lucky that we've had some other really competent teams like OET go out and look at it for us.
Archaeological field surveys like this ultimately aim to bring home any possible physical evidence recorded as part of this mission. This is only one step in DPAA's thorough case progression, which involves teams of experts in various fields, including forensic anthropology. Thousands of hours of archive and laboratory research and hundreds of people work on a case that may make a determination possible. Once DPAA makes a positive identification, a message is sent to their respective service member casualty office, who then notifies the family that their loved one is accounted for. It is an honor and a privilege to be part of this journey. Learn more at dpaa.mil, where updates about this site and hundreds more around the world are announced.
This project was a 2-day underwater investigation mission off the coast of Hawaii. The Ocean Exploration Trust, in partnership with NOAA National Marine Sanctuaries and the DPAA, used shipboard multi-beam sonar to detect potential anomalies located on the bottom, approximately 560 meters or about 1,800 feet deep. Since this site is far too deep for human investigation, we used 2 of the Ocean Exploration Trust's fleet of remotely operated vehicles to investigate the identified anomalies. We then identified distinct areas with aircraft wreckage. These happened to be spread over more than 100 square meters. As you just saw, it included engine parts, part of the cockpit, 1 wing and a propeller, as well as 3 data plates that may help correlate the wreck to a specific DPAA site of interest. But post-processing work is still underway, so no answers on that quite yet. Our secondary objective was innovative in nature. We tested the potential for future remotely operated excavations on DPAA sites. Brushing and sediment suction techniques were tested without disturbing the site's contents or integrity. This is just one example of how we work with partners to support DPAA's accounting mission. And I think I speak for the partnerships and innovation team as a whole when I say that it's truly an honor to work with our talented and professional partner teams. In conclusion, DPAA is dedicated to working with partners and expanding the agency's capabilities and capacities. Similarly, our partners are dedicated to and passionate about the work that they do in support of the DPAA mission. In the end, it all comes back to the people in this virtual room. We do this to provide answers to you, the families, and to the nation. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I will turn it back.
Thank you, Hannah. Appreciate your time and briefing, and thanks to all our speakers. We're going to go ahead and transition to the Q&A session, but a reminder that if you have a question or comment, please put that into the chat, whether you're on dpa.mil, our Facebook page, our YouTube page, or even our LinkedIn page. Now I'm going to and if you have a specific question pertaining to your loved one, to your loss of your loved one, please reserve that for your one-on-one time with the service casualty officer and the analyst. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Lieutenant Colonel Joe Bombach, to moderate our Q&A session. Joe, over to you.
Good afternoon. Our first question is from Craig on the website. Do you search for anyone from World War I?
We do not search for anyone from World War I. When Congress stood up this organization, they added World War II to the mission. And so we are only funded, right, because I talked about funding at the very beginning of the presentation. We are only funded to conduct operations for conflicts dating back to World War II and forward.
Thank you, PDD. The next question is from Jenny on the website. What is the success rate of finding someone when you go out on mission?
Hey folks, this is Dr. Toe. Thank you, Jenny, for that question. That's a really great question. The answer is both simple and complex. The simple answer is that looking at some statistics, if we look at FY22 statistics, and I look at FY22 because we just finished FY23, we're still crunching numbers, but the FY22 statistics, out of 54 recovery sites, we were able to recover possible osseous material in 57% of those sites. Now, possible osseous material is the more biological word for bone. But possible osseous material could be anything from definitely human bone to it's bone, but may not be human. We need to go to the laboratory to figure that out. So that was 57% of the excavation sites in fiscal year 22 that produced what we believed was at the very least possible osseous material. That number changes throughout the years. The previous years before that, and I've got the statistics in front of me, 42%, 56%, 79%, 66% in the last several years. Now, whether or not we find remains really depends on a lot of things. Some sites are easier than others. Some sites are much more complex. The sites that are up at like in the Himalayas, for example, it may be physically hard for us to get up there. It may be freezing and physically hard for us to do the work on that site, but that site's been relatively untouched since the time that it crashed. So the chances of us finding remains there are pretty high compared to a site where the site is flat and I drive up there with a car. So the work is actually not very hard, but because of a lot of urban site transformation, it's harder to find remains there because the remains have been either really moved or destroyed. It also depends on what you consider. Your question was success rate of finding remains out on mission. It depends on how long the mission is. If some recovery missions are only 20 days long, that's obviously got less of a chance of finding remains on a recovery mission that is 100 days long, which we have done in the past. We did earlier this year and we're doing right now. So the swag numbers of statistics is 57% for fiscal year 22. That's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Toe. The next question is from Craig on our website. How do you determine where to go? This is for Dr. Christensen.
Well, from my perspective as an SRE, an archaeologist, I go where I'm told to go. The sites are selected by planners off of our MIL and MEL, our master investigation list and master excavation list, and which I think will be discussed later. And from those lists, the planners will select sites for given missions based on all sorts of other logistical questions. What works best in that area in that time frame? And the sites are chosen to go on to be put on the MIL and MEL based on what analysts and historians and archaeologists think is the potential for a given site to yield evidentiary material and ultimately remains of a missing individual.
Thank you, Dr. Christensen. The next question is from Jimmy on our website. I went to school to be an archaeologist. Can I help at all?
I appreciate that question very much. Thank you, Jimmy. Shovel bums unite. We call ourselves shovel bums. The DPA has a whole wealth of archaeologists that work. The applied archaeologists, the ones that actually go out into the field for the organic teams, we're in the laboratory. There are a fair amount of applied archaeologists here in the laboratory. We also have our historical archaeologists that work in the regional directorates that help with they're not the applied archaeologists, they don't go in the field, but they help tremendously with the archaeological background of cases and knowing how to necessarily progress on a case. We also have archaeologists working in our agency to help with the partner side of the house and trying to arrange partner excavations. I've secretly made a joke that said that I will take over all the directorates one archaeologist at a time. So the more, as far as I'm concerned, the more archaeologists we have, the better, because the archaeologist really is the one that combines both the historical information, the field ops, the applied part of it, as well as bringing everything into the laboratory. So that's a really great question. I welcome any discussion with an archaeologist at any time, anybody for that matter, but definitely shovel bums unite, keep your trowel sharp, and I appreciate that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Toe. The next question is from Anne on our website. What types of scientists work for you?
Well, in addition to all of these shovel bums, here in the Scientific Analysis Directorate, we have physical anthropologists. Most of our anthropologists do both archaeology in the field and analysis of skeletal remains at home, but we have some who just do the skeletal analysis and do not deploy as archaeologists. We have isotope scientists who are working, who extract, who process bones to determine stable isotope ratios in them and hopefully reconstruct where a given individual was from. We have quality control people. We have geographic information system specialists. And what we do not have any DNA scientists. We kick all of that over to AFDIL at AFMUs, but we have people who cut bone samples and send them to AFDIL for processing. And that about wraps it up.
Thank you, Dr. Christensen. Next question is from Patricia on our website. How many types of DNA do we have?
Yeah, so this is a complicated question. It's a lot of biology packed into a very short period of time. But we have nuclear DNA, and this is the DNA contained in the nucleus. This is what most people think of when we're talking about the human genome. And inside the nuclear DNA, you have chromosomes. It's packaged in chromosomes. You have autosomes, which are chromosomes 1 through 22, and then you have sex chromosomes, X and Y, that make you either male or female. That's all in the nucleus. Outside the nucleus, we have mitochondrial DNA that is found inside the mitochondria of the cell. So we have multiple different types of DNA tests that we can do with both nuclear DNA. This would be autosomal STR typing, Y STR typing, and SNP analysis. And then we can do mitochondrial DNA sequencing on the mitochondrial DNA as well.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. The next question is from Larry on our website. If there is no valid FRS, can you use commercial DNA trees like 23andMe?
Yeah, so we are looking into these commercial DNA resources, and they're used in a process called Forensic Investigative Genetic Genealogy, or FIG. So FIG, what it does is produces an investigative lead, and that investigative lead, or a missing individual in this case, it has to be confirmed with a confirmatory validated DNA test. In crime labs, that is STR typing. But as we've been talking about today, the DPAA samples often have very degraded DNA that is not amenable to STR typing. And so in order to confirm that investigative lead, we need to use SNPs. That's why we're doing the SNP capture validation and why we're creating that capability for confirmatory testing with SNP analysis. So yes, in the future we will get there, but first we have to develop that confirmatory test.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. The next question is from Kay on our website. What do MIL and MEL stand for, and what are their differences?
My name is Dane Magoon. I work I'm a Vietnam War analyst, and I brought this issue up during my talk earlier. The MIL is the Master Investigation List, and it can be looked up as a setup or staging for ramping up specific cases for eventual recovery operations. And we send teams out in the field to talk to people and to do site survey work. And we collect that information, and we use it to assess whether cases and sites are valid for further work. And the MEL is the Master Investigation List, which reflects the further stage of this process, where we actually have a list of cases related to specific sites that have been approved for recovery. Now, for agency-wide, currently right now, on the MEL, the Master Excavation List, we have 320 approved sites. And for the MIL, the Master Investigation List worldwide, we have 573 loss incidents across all conflicts. Looking at Vietnam, we have 184 incidents or cases listed on the mill, and we have 121 approved sites that have been approved for excavation at this point in time. Most of the letters are the same. The real key difference there is between the I for investigation and the E for excavation. One being the setup and the vetting process for case leads, and the other one being the vetting process for recovery operations targets. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Magoon. The next question is from Brianna on our website. How do I give you my DNA?
This, you should contact your service casualty officer to discuss whether you are a viable DNA reference from your relative. So the service casualty officer.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. The next question is from James on our website. How can I get my uncle's military records? So family members of the missing can contact their SCO to inquire about military records, or they can also request them through the National Archives. The next question is from Reese on Facebook. Is there a possibility that remains were misidentified back during the war, that an unknown grave contains the remains of someone that isn't on list of still missing? Then where wouldn't be DNA samples to truly ID those remains?
That's a really great question, Reese. I give you brownie points for asking a really great question. And it's also a very hard question to ask because the answer is yes. Is it possible? It's not just possible, it's a fact. We have been able to figure out that there are remains that were misidentified in the past. Techniques were different back then. The threshold to identify was different back then. And the goals were different back then. The goals, of course, is still identification, but in whoever's making the decisions, sometimes they make a decision based on a different threshold of evidence that we would have today. So when that happens today, what we would do is after the abundance of information where we have concluded that there's been a misidentification made in the past, we will write an inaccurate identification historical document that actually says these remains that were identified in the past are incorrect. And the reason why we know that is because we have remains in the laboratory that duplicates those remains that are conclusively of this individual that we've now identified. Therefore, by definition, the identification in the past is incorrect. It does happen. It doesn't happen all the time. It's the exception, not the rule. But when it does happen, it does open up a bit of a can of worms of trying to figure out, well, what happened back then versus what we have now versus what's left to do on this particular case. And if we recognize that there's a misidentification in the past, well, then who was that individual in the past? Who are those remains in the past? Then that spins up a whole new type of analysis to try and figure out who that individual is. So very good question, difficult question to ask, but a very good one. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Dr. Cho. The next question is from Larry on our website. Disinterment is not done without 50% FRS, but why not disinter to protect against environmental degradation of remains in the ground for possible identification later?
This is Dr. Christensen again. Larry, that is a good question. The simple answer is that once remains have been buried in an official grave in a national cemetery, the amount of environmental degradation over time is not that great. Most of the environmental degradation occurs within a fairly brief window after remains are buried. Once the environment has stabilized and the remains have adjusted to that environment, there is not a huge amount of additional degradation in most circumstances. And when we do not yet have the capacity to identify those remains in the short to medium term after exhuming them, we feel it's significantly more respectful to leave them in a grave in a cemetery than exhume them and keep them on a shelf for potentially years to come. But very good question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Christensen. The next question is from Mary on our website. What else remains to be done in the Punch Bowl Cemetery?
That is a great question. I'll take that one. And some people in the agency will probably think I planted that one because I love telling this story. The Punch Bowl, we were coming up on 70% disinterments of all the Korean War unknowns. And with the completion of the Anaramaru project this summer, we cleared 50% of the World War II unknowns. So we are well on our way to looking at some sort of end cycle for Punch Bowl in the next 5 to 10 years, which I'm really excited about. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Rose. The next question is from Larry on our website. How deep is deep water for remains to be declared unrecoverable?
I'm going to follow with Dr. Rose by saying I think someone may have asked me to plant that question too, because I have no shortage of time to talk about our underwater capabilities and our underwater teams. So how deep is too deep? It's a funny question, because if you think about how deep the Titanic's at 12,000 feet. 12,000 feet. We can get submersibles down there, sure. But it's not a question of whether something is recoverable or not. It's a question of resources and the manpower that we have and the number of people that we have missing. So if you think about something as deep as the Titanic, that's super deep. But a lot of our losses are not that deep. They're not at 12,000 feet. Anything that's 100, 200 feet, we can do. We've done many of those. Anything past that gets a little bit tricky. Not because we can't do it, but because when you're underwater at 200 feet, the amount of downtime that any of our personnel and scuba divers or human beings, we need to breathe air, the amount of time we have down there to actually excavate is very limited. Anybody who does any scuba diving knows that when you're going that deep, you've got to decompress. You've got to go down there pretty quick, but then you can spend minimum time there, and then you have to decompress real slowly, sometimes hours. I'm really excited for one of our recent excavations that we just did in Papua New Guinea that's at 257 feet, because we utilized a technology from the Navy where we took personnel and put them in a bell and literally decompressed them to 257 feet below the surface and kept them at that decompressed pressure for 2 weeks at a time. So even though they were living on the boat inside a bubble, they were decompressed at that pressure the entire 2 weeks. They ate at that pressure. It actually changes their voice. They actually talk a little bit like a helium Mickey Mouse voice, but they eat inside the bubble. And then when they go in the bubble and went down to 250 feet, they were actually able to excavate for 6 hours at a time, probably more than that, because they're already at that pressurized level. So it's not necessarily a question of how deep is too deep. It's a question of resources and what we're able to do. If there were no other sites ever except for one loss that was missing, we can throw a lot of our resources at it. But because we have to think about the other 81,000 individuals and the other recoverable cases, we have to sort of spread that wealth around a little bit of our resources. But that's a really great question. The technologies are improving every single day, and I'm looking forward to seeing what else this Navy team can do for our mission. Great question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Toe. The next question is from Daniel on our website. What address and how to identify documents to send for inclusion in an IDPF?
Yeah, thank you for that question. If I understand the question correctly, you're talking about if you have information that you would like to include to advance your case. As far as the IDPF goes, we treat that as a historical document. So that's not something that we're generally adding to. If you have information and this is for everybody, if you have information that you think can contribute to the advancement of your case or in the case of any unresolved service members, you can get that to our research staff through your service casualty officer. Of course, I first want to say, if any of you do have information, we're always, it's always welcome. It's always something that's going to help us put the puzzle pieces back together and try and incorporate as much information as we can into all of your cases. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Dr. Bracken. That is the last question that we've received today, so I will turn it back over to Mr. Abweg.
Thank you, Colonel Baumbach. Just before I go into the admin notes, we didn't get a chance to show this slide. This is Dr. Marshall's contact information that she wanted to showcase. I'll leave it on the slide for a few seconds. It's going to be archived in our live stream. You got it right there. Stop sharing. Appreciate everyone's time. Thank you to Colonel Baumbach for moderating our Q&A session. Thank you to all the panelists for speaking today. And a reminder that our live stream will be archived on our dpa.mil website, our Facebook page, YouTube page, and LinkedIn page. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to pass it back to our Principal Deputy Director, Mrs. Fern Sumter-Winbush. Ma'am.
Thank you, Mark. Again, a wholehearted thank you to all of the families who have attended today. We know that you have options on where to spend your Saturday, and we are ecstatic that you chose to spend it with us. I hope that we've been able to provide some answers and that you've been able to learn a little bit more about what DPAA is doing within this mission space. As I said earlier, we could never build an agency large enough to execute this mission, to get after all of the 81,000, and then, of course, the 37,000 that we believe are recoverable. But I guarantee you, every single day, not only the individuals, military and civilians, who you met on this call today, that we spend a huge amount of our time going after the individual cases, making sure that we stay well-informed about what is going on with your loved one's loss. Now, with so many cases, obviously we can't work every single case every day. However, none of the DoD personnel who were lost dating back to World War II have been forgotten. We know their names, we know the circumstances, we even have access to classified documents that unfortunately we cannot share with you. We all have clearances at a level that we are able to dive deep into those classified archives to make sure that we have the latest and greatest information about your loved one's loss. I want to thank the entire team. This was an excellent, excellent family member update. We overcame obstacles having to put this on virtually, but I think the team has done a fantastic job, and I really appreciate that effort. Again, I hope you, the families, have learned something today, that you got your questions answered, and that you had a fruitful one-on-one with your analyst and your service casualty officer. With that, I'd like for us to go ahead and close. Wish you a hearty, healthy, and great weekend. Thank you so much. It's been our pleasure.